All right, we should be live now. Might take a few seconds to patch through to YouTube, but we are ready to go. And we are going to pick this up where we left off yesterday. Our conversation went on way longer than we expected. And I
Yep.
didn't give you enough time also. I had so much stuff I needed to go through, the framework, and I just kept going and going and going.
Hey,
But
I saw some of the comments having a crack at you about that, and trust me, when I'm
yeah,
the host, when I'm the host, people have a crack at me about that too. So it's kind of
yeah.
universal.
When Jack James had watched in on our first part, and she said, "Oh, it was great. She loved it." I said, "Really? I think I spoke too much because I was trying to get all this stuff out." And she said, "No, no, no, it was good." But she actually brought something else up, which I'll mention in a moment. But before we get into that, I think we should just do a quick recap for everybody who's joining and didn't see the first episode yesterday. We were speaking about anti-China propaganda in Australia. We were speaking about Rex Patrick, a senator who I was supposed to have an interview with, but ended up backing out the last minute. We were speaking about ASPI, Australia Strategic Policy Institute. Sometimes I call it Partnership Institute. Somebody had a crack at me for that too.
Yeah,
And they are a think tank in Australia that helps shape public opinion, public policy. That's probably where I get the policy part from.
yeah,
And also feeds a lot of information through to media.
yeah.
They're
Worldwide,
funded
they're
in.
an Australian think tank that's way too influential in Australia, but they have a global influence. Almost every article you'll see around the world on the latest beat up about China invariably quotes the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, and that's why
Over
people
and
need to
over.
know who they are.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, it used to be funny before when people would say, "Oh, there's a Four Corners coming up, or there's a this coming up. How much do you want to bet there's going to be an ASPI
Yeah,
reference in there?"
yeah,
It's just boring to even do that anymore. You know it's going to be in there. Um,
yeah.
and this is a think tank that gets its money from the U.S. State Department, from weapons manufacturers. And the thing that should be infuriating to people is they're ramping up these tensions and causing all these problems, instigating, kind of prodding at this, breaking apart the relationship between Australia and China. And regular Australian business people are suffering from this. They're saying, "Oh, yeah, okay, all right, we can't do anything about this." And as we mentioned yesterday, if a wine producer wants to speak out against it and say, "Hold on a second here, you're destroying my livelihood. Can we ask some questions about this narrative that's going on?" Boom, you get blasted. Like
Well,
how Drew, yeah,
Drew Pablo here. It's McCarthyism.
yeah,
It's
yeah.
just as toxic as the 1950s in America. Your loyalty is questioned if you go against this agenda, this narrative. So most people aren't prepared to do that, and they're watching their businesses just their markets vanish. And these are hard-won markets, and they're just vanishing.
Yeah, and the infuriating thing about it is that the sponsors of ASPI are making record. I mean, well, I don't know if it's record or not, but they're making a lot of money, hand over
A lot.
fist. They're
Yeah,
pulling in a lot of money, selling equipment to counter the China threat story that they just finished producing. And
yeah,
this goes across the board with people buying into this. I mean, even Americans who may look into these pro-war kind of pieces of propaganda and say, okay, something's a little bit fishy here, but whatever. We're supposed to smash China down. This is, we shouldn't let China rise. And they're willing to operate with a bit of cognitive dissonance as if it will benefit them somehow, but it doesn't. These wars, these aggressions, these kinds of imperialist kind of actions, they benefit a very small portion of society at the top in America. If the wealth gap wasn't continually increasing like it was, if the democracy that you're supposed to be able to say something or make changes when people went out to Occupy Wall Street and protested about this very issue, if these things started getting better, maybe the cognitive dissonance would be worth it for some people, saying, okay, all right, we go around the world and we do this stuff and I personally benefit. No, you don't even benefit from this stuff.
no, no. You're
you know?
cannon fodder. You're cannon fodder for this, and you're told that's patriotism, right?
Right.
You're over there in Afghanistan or Iraq, and you're fighting for freedom, but you're just the cannon fodder, and the actual beneficiaries are a very small minority of elites, and it's always been thus. That's the story of imperialism throughout time. It's always been that
Right.
way. There was a I keep forgetting the names of some of these people. There was a really shocking book written in the UK in around the 1870s on this same question, where this author came out and said, "Look, to my fellow Britons, we are not benefiting from our empire, right? And it's began a debate, and it's helped in, there's a small, fairly weak radical current in the UK that's always been opposed to their imperialism for that reason. It's never been able to stop it, unfortunately. Jeremy Corbyn's in that tradition, and look what was done to him, right? Totally smashed because he did stand up to this kind of Anglo-American imperialism. But that's the truth of it, and people just have the wool pulled over their eyes. But it's through a lot of hype. It's always got to be hyped up, and that's ASPI's job in Australia. And we're focusing on there's a relative small handful of politicians that are channels for what ASPI and some of these other agencies come up with.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and I think people should be able to take a step back and look at this stuff, and that actually before we're going to have, for everybody who's tuning in live, we're going to have a section. Maybe we'll look through the questions. You can save some questions for that period. But before we knew we were doing a live stream, I put an invitation out there to for people to ask whatever questions they had. I had one that came through on Twitter that kind of ties in to what we're talking about right now. And I want to pull that up so I can answer that question. I don't think it was asked in good faith, but looking at this person's history, but whatever, no. it's still a good question. It actually is a valid question, regardless. So this was, and I apologize if it was asked in good faith. This actually might have been. I was thinking of a different comment, but he says, "What does criticizing China have to do with warmongering exactly?" So sorry, I think that was actually a good faith question. So. The question, so if looking at the episode, our last episode, the question isn't about criticizing China, it's about fabricating things. It's about jumping to conclusions that aren't there. And the question is, what's the purpose? Why are they doing this? What does this usually mean when you're villainizing an enemy to this point? What are they trying to soften people up for? What are they trying to prepare for? We know that America and the West wants to keep China down. We know that this is getting dangerous in terms of tensions growing and growing and growing. So what are the purposes of these lies? Well, what have the purpose of atrocity lies been before? To excuse invasions, to excuse this very kind of stuff. We should be on high alert right now. I don't know if you want to add.
The truth, but the giveaway is the selective outrage, right? So you could contrast China with, as the great human rights abuses in China that it's being attacked for, with, say, an American ally in Saudi Arabia, and which is a horrifically oppressive regime in all kinds of ways, including the way they choose to execute people. Very few rights for the actual population, massive public surveillance system to keep them under wraps, puts out the most extreme, sponsors the most extreme form of Islam. The whole world knows that, but it's an American and British ally. And you could say it's a client state of the Americans and the Brits. So if the human rights criticisms of China, because that's what it comes down to, the human rights, if the human rights criticisms of China are genuine, these same people would be criticizing all of them, but they don't. And there's a famous memo that's right. You can read it online that the State Department gave to Rex Tillerson in 2018 or 2017 when he took over as Secretary of State under Trump. And the memo is blatant. We use human rights against our enemies, not our allies, against our adversaries, not our allies. It is purely cynical. It's purely to further an agenda. So that takes that tells you that it's not about criticizing China per se. It's why they're singling out China for undue, for over the top criticism, for relentless criticism, for hysterical criticism that is non-stop. And it's not that they're influencing China with the non-stop criticism. They're influencing you, right? Manufacturing consent in you, because this is how they achieve their strategic goals. And their strategic goals are at least to confront China, and some of these strategists in Whitehall and the State Department and the White House would fantasize that in a full-scale confrontation, China would back down, and they say the same thing about Russia. And the problem is that's a fantasy position, because it's informed by a certain self-esteem that they don't deserve anymore, right? They cannot back it up. America doesn't have the military. It can't win any war, let alone a war against China. So they're hoping the bluff will work, they can back it down. And what makes us worry, Daniel, is that they create the preconditions where a single spark can trigger something that they wouldn't even, 1 in a billion people contemplate nuclear war as a viable option, right? Most of these strategists wouldn't contemplate that, but they're putting us in the position where it can quickly escalate to that, right?
Yeah, I mean, it could even take just a mistake, something unintentional.
Yeah.
It could be something unintentional where the tensions reach that point. And yeah, exactly what you said about the selective outrage as well. I remember, I can't remember who the quote was from, but they say that the media doesn't necessarily tell you how to think, it tells you what to think about. But I would take it one step further. It does actually teach you how to think as well. But you're right. I mean, I just shared this morning on my Twitter a really interesting article from, or a Twitter thread from Grey Fox. And they've been going through all of these ASPI reports, all of these kind of Adrian Zenz reports, and going through in detail, saying this doesn't make sense. How do you jump to this conclusion? How does this mean this? Well, no, hold on a second. The translations are wrong here. And there's no transparency about the methodologies they use as well. And so what this person did was they said, you know what, let me take a step back. Let me take a look at how a report about genocide in Myanmar looks. Like, let's see how they play that out.
Yeah,
Everything
right.
is completely transparent. Everything is, they talk about how they randomized it in order to get, to make sure they're not getting, they're not basically running a Texas sharpshooter campaign where, you've got the bullet holes already and you're painting the everything around it, your target around it. They talk about the fact that there is a refugee crisis. People are trying to leave, even though they're being chased to the borders with guns. And he made the point. He says, when people are, you don't underestimate people's will to survive when they're being persecuted like this. So this idea that they just can't leave Xinjiang. No, they would find a way to leave if they could. But it was a really good contrast to show what is reporting, what does honest reporting look like when you don't need to use your imagination, when you don't need to jump to conclusions that don't make sense. And I think that was really valuable.
Well, and you never know until you get to know them. You never really know the intentions of any of the individual journalists involved that work for Reuters or BBC or whatever and come up with this stuff. Over time, you see a pattern, you get to know them. But at first, you hear they've written a report on or BuzzFeed's the other one. So BuzzFeed is this mainstream investigative journalism outfit now. But anyway. So you hear that they've written a report on the camps in China, etc., and you think, well, would that journalist be deliberately making this up? But then you look at their sources, and that's why and their sources are Adrian Zenz, ASPI, a very small group of the usual suspects are behind all of these reports, and that's why we have to focus on those guys, because it's the journalists are being duped, right, to a large degree as well. They have editorial boards that are telling them, we need to report this. They don't tend to set the editorial agenda. They just do as they're told, but they're not hardly any of them are going there and actually seeing it themselves. Or if they do, they're going there with prejudices and setting up the kind of conflicts we talked about yesterday, right? And that's the problem is the information that comes out of them is completely unreliable. But if we can get people to understand who their sources are, this small handful of people that are tied in with, the National Endowment for Democracy and these kinds of outfits, then people can see that there's an overarching strategy here, and it's the strategy that's driving the criticism of China. It's not people of goodwill saying tut tut tut. I think that's an unfortunate way for a country to behave.
Yeah, absolutely. And the whole infrastructure is built around this as well, where if you look at the job postings for journalist jobs that are covering India, covering Russia, the bias is built into the job posting already, where it says this is the most evil, thing that we face. They're interfering with our elections and they're doing all this stuff. Yeah. How does it feel that? How do you feel about wanting to report about this? Somebody who doesn't believe in that stuff would look at that and say, "What? You're already telling me what's going on. I'm not going to get the chance to look into this myself." and they would walk away from it. The only person that would be interested in it saying, yeah, I love talking about this. I love talking about Russian interference and stuff like that.
They get the job.
And that's why Noam Chomsky talks about when he was sitting down with a BBC reporter a long time ago. You know, the BBC reporter asked him, "Well, how do you know that I'm self-censoring?" And he says, "No, I'm not saying you're self-censoring. I believe you believe everything you're saying. I'm just saying if you believed something else, you wouldn't be sitting where you're sitting." Now it does go one step further, because when the whole the narrative on Israel changed, suddenly it was okay to talk about the plight of the Palestinians in a more open way than we were ever able to before. At least it was safer to do so. DW from Germany came out with these memos telling all of their journalists, sending it out, saying, these are the reporting guidelines for Palestine. You can't call it an apartheid. You can't do this. You can't do that. And like managing their language. So absolutely, the news is being shaped around whatever the geopolitical requirements are and interests or corporate interests, whatever it may be. And people definitely need to understand that. So what we'll do now is, once again, I was supposed to have an interview with Rex, and Robbie and I were going to get together for a chat anyway. So but what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to go through a little bit quicker, because we only got through a part of it, the message that I had sent to Rex after he backed out of the interview but agreed to reply to some written questions. And he didn't really respond to them.
When I read your written questions, you shared them with me before you sent them to him. I said to you, can I publish these? Because the questions are dynamite. And people should see these questions and see what Rex Patrick is trying to duck in not doing this interview. Because he may think he's genuine on this question, and I'm not quite sure about that. I don't know enough about him to say he's not, but he's certainly avoiding putting himself in a position that where he could be exposed to information that challenges what he thinks he knows.
Right. That's right. And I mean, Jack James, who I mentioned before, Western propaganda analyst, she mentioned before, she's been involved in public service, I believe, and she said, you're just going to get some sort of a basic reply that doesn't really address anything. But I'm trying to find the chat history. She watched our episode yesterday, and she wanted to point out that Rex's response, that saying that they would have had legal action if it was false, basically insinuating that that's why it must be true. First of all, we saw the hearing where that was clearly false. There were people pursuing legal avenues. But second, she wanted to point out that in Australia, companies can't sue for defamation, I believe it was. And she said, here are the rules. Unless you're a nonprofit, unless you're less than 10 employees and all this stuff. So they couldn't do that anyway. So saying that was meaningless and a little bit misleading. That
was my understanding as well, I thought. But I'm not a lawyer. Jack is. So I'd take her word for it. Defamation is only something that can apply usually to individuals. Corporations can find other grounds to sue on different things to do with damages, but his claim there was so thin it's not funny. But I think it was written just to put people off the scent. They're very confident that they've got the whole narrative machine behind them, Daniel, and they can get away with rather loose claims.
Yeah, exactly. And they don't really need to engage with honest criticisms or genuine questions because personally, I think they know what they're doing. I think they know it's kind of a sham. And as other people have pointed out, and I think you mentioned as well, I think, that's the popular thing to do. It's the way to get a lot of attention. So this whole ecosystem just snowballs and it builds on itself. Yeah, because the politicians say, well, this is what I got to do. In Canada, when they were running the Uyghur genocide kind of vote in Parliament, even if you were an MP who doubted the narrative, you can't go on record voting against that motion. When the public has been propagandized that much, if you do that, that's like political suicide. And so when I reached out to an MP in Canada also saying, listen, I want to have a chat with you. I wanted to have an honest chat with him to really see how he felt about it, how informed he was on the topic. But same thing, last minute he backed out. They started asking questions, asking my channel name, looked at my channel and said, oh shoot, this isn't somebody looking to just boost these claims. This is somebody who's going to actually ask us some critical questions. This is my theory about what happened in their mindset. And they said, no, we're walking away from this.
Because they've got the public to the point where you only have to say it's China, and they'll believe anything you say. This is why Chinese people are getting bashed in the streets of Australia, right? They have drastically turned public opinion into a very hostile bent against China and by definition against Chinese people, because part of the McCarthyite suspicion falls on Chinese people. You know, there was a book here in 2018 published called Silent Invasion, which said that 30% of Chinese people are loyal to Beijing. Well, that's the biggest single ethnic group in Australia. So if you read that book, you heard claims based on that book, and that eventually filtered down to the average redneck yobbo Aussie, right? And you've heard, or you don't know that claim is based on some guesstimate. There's not a study or anything like that, right? You've just heard that there's a whole bunch of Chinese Australians who are loyal to Beijing. So if there's an invasion, right, because China's going to invade us. If there's an invasion, this will be the fifth column inside. Then you want to distrust everything about China, and in that climate, they can say anything. Critical of China, make all sorts of claims, and nobody stops for a second and thinks, why would that be true? You know, things like I could go through them all day, but you know what I mean.
No, I know what you mean, and it becomes dangerous for the ordinary people on the ground as well. Just a quick note that the connection is getting a bit choppy. If I do drop off at any point, just wait for 30 seconds and I'll pop back in. The situation is happening in reverse in China, where a lot of people in the streets are confronting Western journalists. They've just had enough. And I have a good friend in Guangzhou, who asked me what my thoughts are on it. And I said, I can understand why they're just kind of sick and tired of it. So they saw this journalist setting up his camera, pointing in the direction of the floods in Zhengzhou that still had a bit of water, not pointing the camera towards the place where life is back to normal. And they say, you know what, I've seen this before. I want to have a talk with this guy. And some of them were really respectful. Some of them got a little bit heated. They were like raising their voice, but they were saying, can you paint our country nicely or something like that? There wasn't physical violence or anything like that. But everybody blew up. They were like, oh my God, look at these Chinese people going after these Western journalists without asking any questions, saying, well, why are they upset? There was another really sad case where I saw where there were some girls crying outside of a subway station. They managed to crawl out of the subway car, and other people who were on that same train didn't make it. And they were there crying. And a guy came up, because there was somebody filming them crying, and a guy came up saying, don't just slander our country or something like that, and don't paint us badly, something along the lines of that. And then the two girls who were crying, they kind of like, oh, and then they withdrew. And so people looked at that, and they were saying, oh my God, look at this, you can't even grieve in China. But that guy wasn't telling those girls to get lost, and he was talking to the journalist. And I can't remember who it was, there was a guy who came out saying, see, this is what's going on, you can't even grieve in China, I care about the Chinese people, and look at those people. And it's like, well, hold on a second, do you care about the guy who walked up and who was upset enough to say to this journalist, why are you painting us like, why are you always painting us like this? And why do you think those two girls walked away? Was it because they were afraid of that guy? The guy wasn't telling them to get lost. It's because they realized, they say, oh, you're right. You know what? We can't even grieve in peace here because we know that the Western media is going to take this and we're going to become the representation of what's wrong with China or something like that. We just want to come here and grieve in peace. They didn't look at it that way.
And a lot of the Western analysis tends to focus on this quote unquote rising nationalism in China. But it's as a one-sided thing without bothering to just turn around and look at the rising anti-Chinese nationalism in the West, which has been much more sudden, much more dramatic, and it's incredibly hostile to the point where you've got politicians like our friend Rex here, who we're talking about, who's just dropped all reason to appeal to that, so that in the vain hope he'll get re-elected. And he's prepared to say the most outrageous things to do it. And every time he does, he's rubbing, like he's consciously insulting the Chinese government, and it's just adding to the climate that's destroying any chance that Australia and China may mend its relationship, which a lot of people want. At least get it on some kind of more even footing so we can talk to each other. We don't talk to each other anymore. Our biggest trading partner, we don't talk to them. And we would at least want to talk to them, right? At the height of the Cold War, the real Cold War, there was never a point where US and Russia didn't talk to each other, right? It's got more dangerous since then. There's been points since then where they haven't talked to each other. We're at this point with our biggest trading partner that we don't talk to them. And we think it's their fault because they don't want to take our calls. But we let our parliament carry on like two Bob watches, saying the most outrageous things about them, and it's just not helping. And it's the climate.
I think obviously there's advantages and disadvantages to every political system around the world, and it just so happens that when you're in a system where you have to vote for people, appealing to people's emotions and rallying them up is unfortunately something that you've got to do. It's just one of the things that goes along with that kind of a voting system, or at least it's descended into that. It's the easy way to do to do things. And that's why Kishore Mahbubani was talking about as well. He's saying, you really want China to have the exact same kind of Western liberal democracy as the West. They will become the most nationalistic people, and they will go into their emotion. The people will appeal to their emotions, to want revenge for the century of humiliation, to want revenge for what the Japanese did. These things are kind of being contained to a certain degree. Like if China really wanted to take advantage of this Western journalist bashing thing, they could so easily prop this up. If anything, they've been kind of,
Sure.
And
they had
go ahead.
With that. I was going to say, see, we're a political party in Australia, and so we know what, not overly successfully at elections, but we do get quite a few things done. And we have a view of from our experience of Australian politics, and I think it's true generally in the West, that democracies have lost their way, right? And that's in recent decades. It wasn't always this bad. Now, there's other periods where it was this bad. So it's never always the same. There are some periods when it's better, and you get political leaders that appeal to the positive side of their constituents and their people and say, look, this is what we can do, right? America is let's put a man on the moon. And even though it's in the context of the space race, etc., it was a positive thing to aspire to. Let's do that. We have, a few years ago, we had a conference. I'll just hold this up here. You can see it. And this is what it was. This is what we called it. The World Land Bridge, Peace on Earth, Goodwill Towards All Men. And that's a map of the world, from the North Pole down. And essentially, it was focusing on the Belt and Road, the implications of the Belt and Road Initiative for the whole world. And we're trying to say to our fellow Australians, look, this was in 2015. So it's like it's been 7 years since the global financial crisis. The global financial crisis showed just how actually fundamentally economically bankrupt the Western countries are. They've got overly financialized economies where it's just all about money changing, right? And we're not doing anything. China, on the other hand, is a productive powerhouse. It was its investments after the global financial crisis in real things that's kept the whole world economy propped up. It certainly kept Australia's economy propped up, supplying the coal and the iron ore, etc., for that massive industrial investment. And now they're saying that the whole world do that. And we're saying to our fellow Australians, look, we could be just as successful as China, because this is what we used to do anyway. Let's go back to that approach. Then you got grounds for cooperation, right? If we're all committed to economic development for the whole world, raising everybody up, that's beautiful grounds for cooperation. America should be part of this. I mentioned this yesterday, right? Imagine if America and China were partners in the Belt and Road. No one could accuse China of taking advantage of the powerful United States, right? And the whole world could have a dramatic economic improvement out of that. This is the alternative that is there on the table. This is China's offer. There's political currents like ours in every country saying we should do this, but there's like this warmongering gang. Sometimes we call it the war party, is in power in the United States, and it's a bipartisan party. It's a one party with two branches, right? in power in the UK, in power in Australia. The only place that gives you the slightest grounds for a glimmer of hope in the Five Eyes is New Zealand. They say if because New Zealand's in the Five Eyes, but the New Zealanders say we're the eye that's winking. They're not perfect. I talked to a gentleman there, Arthur Gatland, who's trying really hard to combat the anti-China propaganda in New Zealand, but New Zealand's copying it because it actually has tried to be a bit more independent than the rest of us Five Eyes. But we're governed by war parties, and if people, so we see, there's an alternative there that if people could assess it on its merits, Daniel, they would want it. Average people in democracies would want it. They're not given the chance to assess it on its merits, because when we say, look, here's this great, I'll put it, it's this extreme. The people I talk to in Australian politics are the most pro-infrastructure, right? Like we are. We want to build big water projects and all sorts of things. They know China does it, right? But they're the most anti-China at the same time. Yeah. And they want to be allied to countries that don't do it, that stop us from doing that sort of thing, right? So their anti-China bent trumps anything that their natural instincts to do this stuff, because it's been so poisoned. However, there is really good news. There was a and this is what gives us hope. There was a paper written by an American academic and a Russian academic in 1988, just as the Cold War was coming to an end. And I forget the exact title. It's called something to do with the enemy image. And this was a paper where these two academics assessed how important it was for both sides of the Cold War to inflate this enemy image against the other in their country, because it kept, not only did it keep the Cold War going and justify the military spending, and it kept the people pushing that in power, right, with that enemy image, and it allowed them to introduce extreme policies that really undermine people's civil liberties in their country, which people were prepared to accept in the name of that enemy image. And then in the middle of this paper, they talk about this one exception to it during the whole Cold War, which was when America decided in the 70s, decided to change its policy towards China for strategic reasons, mostly cynical strategic reasons. They wanted to split China and the Soviets up, right? A bit of divide and conquer.
Right.
At the beginning of that process in the late 70s, the opinion polls showed that 75% of Americans were anti-China, the Reds, the commies, all that sort of stuff. By the early 80s, by about 83, 25% were anti-China, 75% were pro-China. Because the machine, to achieve their objectives, stopped pumping out all the propaganda, right? Focused on the positive, and public opinion went with it. And that's how it happens. So we're combating the bad stuff now, but we hold this glimmer of hope that if we keep doing our job, we can actually eventually create policy changes that achieve a positive change in public opinion.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it is remarkable. I think people really underappreciate how easily their opinions are formed. Nobody likes to believe that, and that's why people probably disregard it. They say, no, I am my own person, and I came to this idea on my own. We all are subject to this. We all of us. I mean, even ourselves. You have to constantly continue questioning yourself and things like that. Like when I went to Xinjiang, I didn't go to Xinjiang and talk to people. I mean, I knew people from Xinjiang for a long time, but I went, looking to be proven wrong. When I went there, I reached out to anti-China people, sent them messages saying, if you were going, what would you look for? Tell me what I should be looking for. What kinds of questions would you want to ask? And I was even quite, so the first part of my trip was completely on my own. And after, when I reached out to some people in the government to try to get more access, when I was with them, I was really blunt with them. I was in the, because I know some situations with, I have a Kazakh friend from Xinjiang. And he's very pro-China, but he has a lot of issues with the way that the policies were rolled out, and he doesn't like with how some of them were done. And so I told them right from the beginning, I said, you know what I think you guys do? I think, and I kind of wanted to see their reaction when I said this. I said, I think you make people hate China, and then you punish people for hating China. And I just wanted to see their reaction. And they kind of turned red, and they're like, oh, and then, they were willing to say that, okay, there are some issues that, of course, could have been done better, but it's very far from what the Western media is talking about. But we're all at risk of this, and
Sure.
you should always be questioning yourself. You should be searching things out to prove yourself wrong, not to prove yourself right. But
people say to me, why don't you criticize China? Well, first of all, I don't live in China. I just know China's a country of human beings. Therefore, there'd be lots and lots of mistakes, like there is in every other damn country. What I'm trying to say to people is, take the China factor out of your equation. So if this particular mistake or abuse or stuff up that you're hearing about from China was in any other country, what would your reaction be? When it's from China, you go, oh, that's the CCP, and that's the system.
And in reverse, Australians, if that image of people of Australian SAS soldiers jumping out of the helicopter, walking up to a Muslim face down in his field and shooting him through his head while he was holding his prayer beads. In reverse, if China did that, if that was China that did that, do you think that image would have just suddenly disappeared? They're still using photos from 1989 without a full understanding of what happened in Tiananmen Square, by the way. They're still using photos of that. Do you think after just a few months, it would have just disappeared from everybody's minds, just like that image of the Australian soldiers did? No. Well, it would be here. It would be here to stay. But
it'd be at the start of every broadcast. They have when they do their montages, they would be using that image.
It would be included permanently.
Yeah. Yep.
It would be included permanently. It would be in every discussion, But with this is getting a little bit off topic, but it's kind of interesting. We're talking about the issues with the way the system works right now. You're talking about this, fear-mongering system. There's some great documentaries by somebody named Adam Curtis also that explores this. Definitely recommend checking them out. Considering that it's easier to fearmonger and appeal to fear or create an enemy than it is to focus on the positives and things like that. In the issue of the kind of situation with me, so let me back it up too, because the issue with media as well is, of course, that when China's going out with these Belt and Road initiatives, and we're seeing actual real change in all of these, African countries. Everything they do is misrepresented. The Sri Lanka port thing has been debunked, the way that it's covered and all of that kind of stuff. But there's real positive change happening. However, when the news reports on it, the news is supported by advertisers, big corporations and things like that. These are the people who have something to lose by China making inroads into the global south. It is these huge corporations that had monopolistic control over the resources of these countries. They are the ones who will benefit from keeping the status quo. So when you have this fight of these corporate interests shaping public opinion, when you have politicians that can pull on people's emotional strings using negatives more effectively than positives, I mean, how do we get out of this? What's the solution? Obviously, there's the additional element in the U.S. where you literally have senators who are funded by these people as well. And when these corporations are sponsoring their campaigns, they're expecting a return on investment. They're not just giving this just because they like democracy. They're looking for influence. I mean, I know Kevin Rudd is on a campaign to try to address the media issue and stuff like that. But what is the solution? How do you fix democracy again?
Well, I think it, like I said earlier, it fluctuates in terms of effectiveness. And at a time like this, when you've got such a media-driven agenda, then the democracy is pretty much hamstrung, because in any democracy, if 90% of the public have been conditioned to be really hostile to something, like they are to China and Australia, then that distorts the democracy, right? So what we did is we have documented in this series of articles called the China Narrative how that came about, because it came about in just a handful of years, right? Given that the base was about 40% of Australians were always hostile to China, and that would have come down from the 90s. In the 90s, when Richard Gere was making his Red Scare movies and all that kind of stuff, right? That was the previous peak of anti-China stuff, but that was sort of, more attached to the Cold War, etc. It gradually came down and down, and we got more and more Chinese people visiting here, a lot of Chinese tourism, etc. But there was this hardcore of about 40% hostile. So now that's over 80%, and that's within, I kid you not, no more than 3 years have done that. Right, the polls show it's that quick. So we've documented the people that push that narrative. We've named them all, and we have decided that as an Australian political party with very few connections to anyone Chinese, we actually do not have a Chinese Australian, faction of supporters, if you will. Right, I only know less than a handful of Chinese Australians myself. I'm not doing this because I know the Chinese community. I'm doing this because I know the Australian community, and I know what's a better way for the world. So we feel that, okay, we're not a vested interest. We don't take Chinese money. Some of our two major political parties, Daniel, they're whores. They're available for the highest bidder. So, and that's just true across the board. So yeah, some rich Chinese business people came in and thought, well, if the banks can buy them off and whatever, that's how you do business in Australia. You donate to the political parties. I'll donate too. Right, and that gets singled out as foreign interference, etc. So they took money from Chinese interests. I haven't. We haven't. We don't take a cent. But we know that what we know, and so we feel, well, okay, we're not a vested interest. No one can accuse us of being a shill for anybody. We will be really outspoken because we do. We're very alarmed about the war danger. Someone's got to take it on, and we're taking it on with all the force we can muster. And it even upsets our own supporters. Not all of them, but many of them who have been influenced by the anti-China narrative as well, right? But they love us for all the other stuff we do. So, we keep having these arguments with them, but they're gradually getting to see why we're doing it. So that's our approach. It's complemented in Australia by the fact that and it's striking, there's an older generation, and Rudd's not even really part of it. Rudd is a different kettle of fish. But there's an older generation, the people that were in government up through the late 80s and early 90s, the guys who went through a real Cold War, whose whole careers were shaped by the Cold War of we're the West against the communists. They lived that. Mm-hmm. But when the Cold War ended, right, they saw that was a different time then. You don't want to bring that back. We should have a world where we can do business. Doing business is better than fighting. I mean, some of them it's that simplistic, but hey, I prefer that attitude over the alternative, right? And it's these old timers who there's a publication here called Pearls and Irritations, run by a gentleman named John Menadue, who's the former Secretary of the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet under Gough Whitlam and Malcolm Fraser. And Gough Whitlam opened up our relationship with China. Malcolm Fraser was his successor, who I referenced yesterday. He has this blog where all these journalists, diplomats, etc., of his generation contribute to it, and they've become a very prominent voice criticizing this, taking it on. Right? It's just that they're trying to reason with a generation of parliamentarians that have come up in the 21st century, and I'm afraid their outlook is completely different. They've lost any sense of independence, right? They define our sovereignty, as I said, gave you the example yesterday. They define Australia's national interest as American and British strategic agenda, right? That we do not have a separate identity to that. That's how they define it. Right. And that's something that I don't think we're going to change in the politicians. So we have to try and change it in the public. And what if we can get through to them that when we say war, it is serious, because I feel they discount that, and they don't think that it'll come to that. If they did realize it could come to that, then they might be more discerning in what they choose to believe, right? And so we have to keep warning them. This is a real danger. This is based on. Pay attention now. Here's the disinformation it's based on. We all lived through a recent history. Drew Pavlou didn't, but you and I did, We lived through the war crime of the 21st century, which was the Iraq War. We all know that wasn't mistaken intelligence. They deliberately fabricated lies, right? And understand that's what happens in these intelligence circles. So if those same people are giving you these claims now, by default, you must say, if you are a moral person, this is about morality, you must say the onus is on you to prove it. You cannot say, oh, just because it's China, I'm going to accept it. No, the consequences are too grave. And so that's the if we can hit that really hard on one side, but on the other side, point out, as I said before, the world could be such a better place if we actually cooperated on the things that are going to improve humanity, right? The common aims of mankind. The Africans, after 400 years of being looted by European empires, are very willing to speak up and say, whatever you accuse China of doing here, it's a very different experience than we've had up until now, right? They're not coming here with gunboats. They're coming here to do business, and the money they're investing is actually going to build infrastructure. And you can say railroads to nowhere or bridges to nowhere and all this smart aleck stuff that they do, but because that's a good headline for the media. But you go and you take the time, like Deborah Brautigam at the Johns Hopkins University in America, right? She goes and does these studies on the debt trap stuff. She goes and look her up on YouTube. She has years and years and years of presentations she's given where she's gone and done detailed studies of projects in Africa that China's involved in, where there's been all these headlines and claims about them, and she knows the details and says, here's why that is wrong. This is what it's doing, etc. Right? These are Americans that are putting out this information. She's from Johns Hopkins University, and so I can't think of one thing that I've been told China's doing, right? That China's accused of, that when I've looked at it hasn't been baseless. And that's not because I've got rose-colored glasses. It's always been baseless, and organ harvest, right? South China Sea. Hong Kong, the real details about Hong Kong and the national security law, the Uyghurs, etc. All the ones they throw up in their face, they've always been baseless. The debt trap, they take this project. The American Mike Pompeo twisted this project into the greatest threat to the world. No, it was only a threat to one thing, which is America, which is the global supremacy of the American military-industrial complex.
No, that's right. Yeah, he's still on the circuit also. He recently did a new, he was at some sort of a conference, and he was repeating the lie about international flights out of Wuhan also that was already debunked. That was based on the lie from Niall Ferguson, was it?
Niall Ferguson, yeah. See, that's a good one. I had to deal with all those COVID-related ones last year, and we just decided to take them all. Every single one we looked at was always baseless.
Yeah, but what you said, it really drives the point home, is that it's a moral imperative that these intelligence communities provide the evidence. They don't just put these unknowns out there and say, we think this is what's going on, and you say, oh, okay. Intelligence communities lie, and it doesn't always take an entire 20 years or 30 years, however long it takes to declassify documents to learn and see, oh, they just that was a bold-faced lie, and they knew it. It happens within a short span also. You were lucky enough to see, because there's superficial fighting between the two different parties in the U.S., that sometimes some of these things come out. For example,
that's true. That's true. The superficial fighting has been very useful for this purpose.
Right. So look at this. So Trump's security advisor says China has biggest election interference program. This was apparently coming from the intelligence community. Then afterwards, after he was out, they said, well, actually, those same reports he said he was referencing contradicted it. It didn't say they had any kind of a situation. But then they're like, hold on a second, we should still use this somehow. So it turned into China didn't interfere because they didn't really see much of a difference between the two, or, they didn't, but they totally would have done it if they wanted to. which is, such a stretch. Like imagining what's in the minds of the Chinese people, what they would have done if they had a good enough reason. But this is also revealing also when even China doesn't think there's a significant difference between the Republicans and the Democrats. You know what? They're onto something. It's for a good reason. But,
for sure.
Onto your point also about educating people, and you're up against a lot, though. I mean, there aren't many corporations that want to sponsor you to get this kind of a message out, because they are the beneficiaries of the status quo, as I mentioned before. If all of a sudden the Chinese community rallied around you and said, you know what, you're somebody who can represent our country, really well and debunk these lies, that's going to end up being used against you. I mean, I'm really careful about this also, because I have the same problem. I want to grow my channel. I want to potentially build a team or get a camera crew to film some more interesting stuff. But I'm so reluctant about this. I've had at least 20 people reach out to me saying, are you going to open a Patreon account? Or there was one that they wanted me to host something and they were going to pay me for it. I said, no, I don't do that, because I'm really careful about it, just like you. Nobody can say that I'm paid to say what I'm saying. On the contrary, this time takes away from my business. I've got a brew pub. I've got other businesses that I'm running and stuff like that. This takes away from that. If anything,
that's what I first liked about you.
It's costing me to do this. I'm not earning from it, because this is important enough. This is really, really important enough. I've got kids. I don't want them to grow up in World War III. And like you said, it's an absolute moral imperative to do this. But it's kind of that's the difficult thing, isn't it? How do you fight against people that have funding? How do you get your voice out? If ABC or BBC brings you on their show, it's not going to be to honestly engage with your ideas and ask you interesting questions. It's going to be to tear you down, because you're challenging,
I think it's not a night in which all cows are black. So there is a corporate element to this, but there's also a corporate element to the relationship with China. There's a lot of there is an intertwining of the economies, right? And now, full disclosure, as a political party, we opposed those things that made us so. I don't think it's great that we're so dependent on Chinese supply chains as we are. We should be manufacturing something in Australia, right? So we opposed the
Canada. We had the same problem too. Canada, we wanted to reduce. There were programs to try to reduce reliance on the U.S. as well, not to have too much dependence on one single country, right?
Yeah. So that's just common sense, but it's not China's fault that happened. We're the ones that did it, and now that was driven by corporate interests, and they couldn't outsource to China quick enough. Now those ones are kind of torn, because they are part of the establishment, but even those corporate interests, who on any domestic issue, I would be on the anti side to them. But on this side, on this issue, we tend to be sort of, they prefer business to war, and I think, okay, good on them. So the iron ore companies, they're very big mining companies in Western Australia, right, selling iron ore to China. They do not want this to go pear-shaped, because right now they know if the minute that mine in Guinea comes online, if China wants, it will pull the plug, right? And those people, they are the ones that are saying, hang on, what is going on here? So there's more and more people in the corporate sector of Australia speaking up, but they're not speaking up forcefully enough. They're just expressing frustration. They're saying, what's going on here? But then others, that then allows other people to come forward. What's been interesting to me is some of the voices from the military intelligence community that have spoken up, right? So, for instance, a few months ago, one of our former heads of the military, until very recently, actually, so he's just moved on, General Angus Houston, not Campbell, Houston. He came out forcefully and said, China is our partner. China is not our enemy, right? And he's someone who his military career is responding to the fact that, he's no dummy. He's a military guy. He was the head of the army for a long time, responding to how sharply this has turned against China, right? Whereas we officially have a comprehensive strategic partnership with China. That's an official thing that they've both signed on to. Yet we're treating them like they're about to invade us and they're our enemy. And so he was speaking up against these crazy voices in the parliament that are all those people in your image that we've put up for this show, the warmongers, he was speaking up against them to say, cool it. The former Secretary of the Department of Defense, Dennis Richardson, I told you about yesterday, he said, stop wrapping yourself in the Australian flag, right? This is hollow stuff. You're hyping things that don't deserve to be hyped. You're hyping cyber attacks. Yeah, that's what we do too. We do cyber attacks and they do them against us, and he's just far more, older guy again, far more frank and saying, but he's trying to, these are actual real interventions though, Daniel. They're not just trying. I mean, one of these guys, Andrew Hastie, basically accused them of covering their own butts because you exposed us to this. You told us that the relationship with China would be all wonderful. Look, you're just trying to cover your ass. No, they see how dangerous this can be, and they're actually trying to intervene. That's a positive in this whole picture. And even someone like, I'll have to explain what I mentioned about Kevin Rudd before. Kevin Rudd is a China expert. That was his diplomatic background, etc. He speaks Mandarin, but people read too much into that. When he was the foreign minister for a short time after he was prime minister, I mean, he's the guy that WikiLeaks told Hillary Clinton that America should prepare for war with China. I mean, that's just lunacy. Now that, again, he's not in the system and he's part of these global think tanks, he's become a voice of much more moderation, right? Trying to actually calm things down. And I think that's great. I like, one of the things we've highlighted here the other day is Kishore Mahbubani and George Yao, the former Singapore foreign minister, because they had this great podcast about a month ago and it was really good. And we transcribed the whole thing and published it. And we can even put a link below. People could read this or go and listen to it themselves. Because essentially their conversation was, what do Americans need to know about China that would make them stop being so paranoid and alarmed? And here's the tiniest country in Asia, Singapore, which is the most westernized Asian country, and therefore is in a unique position to assess China and assess the West. And essentially, they just went through case after case after case where they're saying, see, this is hype, this is rubbish, and people should listen to it. And I've been noticed Walter Black's comments here on the chat about Taiwan. No, China's really threatening Taiwan. Well, Walter Black, go and read what these two gentlemen talk about with the Taiwan issue, because they make it very clear. And to me, this was the single most enlightening part of the conversation. When America initiated the thawing of relations with China, and they had their initial negotiations between Kissinger and Zhou Enlai, the Chinese were absolutely clear that it all began with America accepting there's one China. And they said it's a bedrock. It's not a card to play. It's a bedrock. The whole basis of nearly 50 years of American relations with China is based on America accepting that. And it's America that's changing that equation now. And it's America trying to play it as a card, and they're destroying the bedrock. So it's America that's putting Taiwan at risk by going along there and helping manipulate Taiwanese elections, pushing the crazy independence people up, etc., and putting at risk this fundamental balance that has always existed that's allowed peace in the region. And then they turn around and say, China's threatening Taiwan. No, China just will not accept anything other than a one China policy, just as most sensible people in Taiwan don't accept anything other than a one China policy. And this is American interference. And this is Singapore experts, real experts, people who know how the world works, explaining this. Right. And I want Australians to hear this, because it's not Chinese people telling us. This is we love Singapore in Australia. It's our favorite Asian country. We all have to go through there to go to Europe, because it's such a long way away. Right. Everyone flies to either Singapore or Dubai. Listen to them. Why can they be so sensible to China and we can't be? It really shows that up here. So these all get to sort of function as interventions into the debate in Australia, which hopefully as people see how serious it is, hopefully starts to have an effect.
Yeah, I think it's a good historical example as well, because if you look at Lee Kuan Yew, the way that he managed relations also, it was from a place of respect. And he actually managed to get China to change course on some of their foreign policy kind of approach by approaching it with a respect. But that's not the point here. Like, America doesn't want to help to work together to solve issues together. It's about instigation. And it's gone on for ages and ages. Like, China has been a country that's been under attack for a long time, from Tibet in the 60s, funding rebels, training them in camps in Colorado to redeploy them in Tibet to cause problems, while the Dalai Lama was signing the 12-point agreement with the central government, while things were improving. They didn't want a friendly relationship there. That was their doing. Even the Dalai Lama's brother in his yeah, exactly. Yeah, and Hong Kong
as well.
And they also ran operations before in Fujian province in relation to Taiwan. But I mean, even the Dalai Lama's brother in his own book said that one of his biggest regrets was, I mean, he's still anti-China, his brother, but he says one of his biggest regrets was working with the CIA. If they managed to accomplish what they wanted in Tibet, it would have just turned into another Iraq or Libya or Afghanistan. And there were even reports of the fact that the Dalai Lama wanted to meet with Xi Jinping when he went to India, and they were actually, from what I've read, they were both actually open to the idea, but it was the Indian government that kind of said, no, that's not going to happen. Obviously, there's been leaks now where we see that the Dalai Lama's phones were bugged with spyware and all this kind of stuff. They do not want a reconciliation of that relationship. They want tension. They want destruction. They want China to be torn apart. And it's a pity, because I think China should be making more of an effort on that front. People don't realize that the Dalai Lama has said over and over again that he doesn't think Tibet should separate from China. People love to talk about the Panchen Lama that he chose on his own with his group outside of China, and say that, oh, this kid is missing, he was probably killed or he was abducted. I mean, the Dalai Lama said that he knows from his sources that he's fine and he's receiving an absolutely fine education, and even went as far as saying that technically it's actually possible to have two Panchen Lamas. Those kinds of things are kept away because these are all tools to help break up China. And so when you get China in this defensive mode, where, okay, now you've got to get a special permit to go to Tibet after, the fact that the CIA was deploying actual rebels in Tibet, or now there's a control of the flow of information, or, all of these things are happening. Nobody takes into account that China has never stopped being under attack. They are continually under attack. Even during the good times, there were all of these different operations going on or funding going on. And when you look back at Western countries, when you had World War I and World War II and all these things, democratic freedoms were suspended during those periods as well. And so here you have a country that is continually under attack. And a lot of people don't take that into consideration. They don't say,
that's what happens
with
that's
Facebook.
What happens in war, and when it comes to national security, that's what happens.
Yeah, absolutely. And when the terrorists were organizing in Facebook groups in Xinjiang, and the government asked for those groups to be blocked, that where they were grouping together and figuring out where to go and all this kind of stuff, Facebook refused it and said, no, that's not how things work here. But if you look at last year, the largest strike in human history happened in India. During that time, the Resign Modi hashtag, the Communist Party of India, all these groups, they were taken off. They're all, for them, it's okay. So these kinds of social media platforms are acting as a tool for Western aggression also. And then on top of the fact that when you're on these platforms, your people, your country is the product. Your country's people become a product of these platforms, which are operating and running their rules to serve American geopolitical interests. I mean, of course, that's dangerous in a time of war. And I was in China when they finally blocked some of these platforms, and I was so annoyed. Like, that those are the platforms I use. And no matter how much you dislike it, and I dislike it, you got to take a step back and think about the context that's going on here as well.
Until I forget when that was, maybe 2013 or 2014, China did that. And I only got on Facebook around 20 15 or 16, and I had resisted
Right.
it all along because I just saw the way it had started, and then the phenomenon had become where everyone was saying, "Hang on, come on, we're all getting obsessed with Facebook." It seems to have calmed down a bit now, but there was a period of time where there was this addiction to this social media phenomenon that people that had just started, and a lot of people were saying, "Hang on, come on, do we want a society where everyone's obsessed with scrolling through their phones all day?" And so I was one of these dinosaurs that resisted as long as I could before I got on it. And to this day, Daniel, I think if the whole world could agree to ban Facebook and Twitter and also almost all social media, right, we wouldn't actually lose much, to be honest. So suddenly, it was always funny to me that suddenly being access to Facebook was a human right. I'm thinking how the people who wrote the Bill of Rights in America in the 1790s, they couldn't have come up with that, or the 1780s, they couldn't have come up with that. It's not it's just but people didn't see it that way. It was spun as if it was some kind of human right that they've been denied.
And even when you're in a situation where you're not constantly attacked, like the U.S. is not constantly being attacked like China has been. I mean, China's not funding an energy regime change operation.
They think they are.
Yeah, they're trying to. They have no. There's actual evidence of
the
U.S. doing it.
Voices in their heads saying they are.
Right, exactly. During the Hong Kong protests, American senators were flying over and cheering on the protesters, the guys who lit an old man on fire, who killed a street cleaner with a brick, who are beating women in the streets. There are videos of this everywhere. You won't see it in Western media. They came over to cheer them on. If the Communist Party of China sent Beijing officials over to the Capitol Hill riots, and we're cheering them on. Oh my! That imagine what would happen. But onto my point, even though this war is not happening in reverse, if there was a social media platform that all of a sudden started overtaking Western platforms, that would be something of concern to the U.S. Not even necessarily because they think, with TikTok, that's where I'm getting, Not necessarily because they think they're really going to run influence campaigns, but because they lose the chance to run their own influence campaigns. When they assassinated Soleimani, people were removed off of Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter when they were sharing the whole details that Soleimani was on his way to a peace conference with the Saudi officials, which could have brought more stability to the region. Like, these are geopolitical censorship campaigns for the West. So all of a sudden TikTok comes along, even though the US kept saying China needs to innovate and stop copying or whatever. Okay, here we go. Here's TikTok. No. We didn't really mean that. Please. Get back down. And they tried everything to try to block it. And then so you imagine if we took it one step forward, further, if America really was under attack by China, Chinese social media platforms, especially if you could prove, like as much as we can prove in the reverse, we're running influence campaigns in the U.S., it would be out. It would be absolutely out. I mean, it's already out of India, right? WeChat was blocked in India. And so people need to take that into
context. Of course. And even without removing the whole platform, Twitter was aggressively blocking pro-Hong Kong accounts. And when I say pro-Hong Kong, I mean pro-real Hong Kong, not pro-America operation in Hong Kong, that are blocking those accounts. I think that the TikTok story that was on our ABC Four Corners the other week is particularly hilarious, though, because they did a whole story on TikTok is harvesting your data, right, to use and the ways they can manipulate with all the algorithms, etc. And so what they're describing is no different than every other social media platform Facebook pioneered. If whatever their accusations were, it's no different than any other, but they're acting as if it was different. And then the expert they got on there to talk about how sinister this is was, of course,
let me guess, ASPI.
ASPI, Fergus Ryan from ASPI, someone I've crossed swords with. But here's the kicker. I didn't even know at the time. Marcus Rubenstein from APAC News pointed this out to me. It's on he's got an article about it. ASPI is sponsored by both Facebook and Twitter. and so when Fergus Ryan was on there representing ASPI, not only did they not reveal that his organization is funded by the United States government, and that alone should make people question why they're rubbishing this Chinese platform. They didn't reveal that they're directly sponsored by the main competitors to TikTok.
Right.
That's
if somebody from TikTok managed to get airtime on a mainstream media outlet, and they were running a smear campaign against Facebook and YouTube, 100%, 1,000%, they would mention in the report that, by the way, this person is funded by TikTok. Just so we're clear here. Even if they managed to get airtime to begin with, which they wouldn't, it's really unbelievable.
Of course they would.
But yeah, I mean, and this is and this is why, I mean, it's going to be so hard to fight back against this. There's this momentum rolling down this hill. It's snowballing. And you've got just guys that, corporations won't be interested in sponsoring, trying to push back against this. I hope we start making some.
No, I've told what I've reported so far. I actually regard that as part of the very gradual change in direction. It's the Martin Luther King thing. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. It's gradually changing course in Australia. The fact that there's all these experienced people speaking up much more intentionally. There was just a couple of months ago, there was a dynamite 3-part article by one of Australia's most experienced journalists, Max Such, who is an older guy now, but he was a legendary investigative reporter in his day. He just weighed in and he came up with this 3-part article pointing out what's driving it, as from what he could tell, what's driving this. And he actually showed that this sudden turn in hostility from Australia to China was planned. And he named the meeting in 2017 where government officials briefed people from the diplomatic corps and business, etc., at this thing called the Lowy Institute, and said, we are going to start pushing back against China deliberately to align with American foreign policy, right? And it was that deliberate. And they said in that meeting, this is a bit of an aside, but it's important detail. In this 2017 meeting, they warned the people present, this will damage our trade. And why that's crucial is because that meant they knew going in that what's the damage to the trade that's happening now would happen. But when the trade started being damaged last year, in the context of of our call for an inquiry into the Wuhan lab, that's when China first retaliated. These same people were acting like, oh, how outrageous for China to attack us on trade. Who could have seen this coming, right?
Why should trade be critical?
No, they knew this would happen.
Right.
And I have to cite there's a think tank, sort of an academic one, but it comes up with useful stuff called the Australia-China Relationship Institute at the University of Technology in Sydney. They've done studies that show that this trade war with China is also completely one-sided, because since 2020, it looks like China's been hitting us on this item, hitting us on barley, hitting us on wine, hitting us on lobsters, hitting us on coal, hitting us on timber, and there's about half a dozen or 7 or 8 things that China's hit and put import bans on, etc. Except the first time China hit us, China's hit. Sorry,
right.
The first time
the
first time China hit us was something which was this barley action. This was an anti-dumping measure they took against us in the World Trade Organization. This was the first time China had ever done that. Yet in the years before that, we had hit them with 117 anti-dumping actions. Even in 2020,
right. I remember.
We hit them 4 times before they hit us back the first time. So we've been hitting them and hitting them and hitting them and hitting them and hitting them with this stuff, right? We're the ones that we didn't just ban Huawei, we lobbied other countries to ban Huawei, which was really politicizing trade, etc. And it took until 2020 for China to finally retaliate. And then that gets spun as if, this is just China coercing Australia. No, the real picture is very different. So people have pointed this out. And so the fact that they're there pointing it out, that to me, when for a few years ago we felt like we were a lone voice almost, I'm glad there's more voices speaking up. That tells me there's a slight shift coming anyway.
Right. Yeah. The I mean, it is pretty amazing. The Huawei thing was really interesting as well. When you really looked at it, what they were talking about was backdoors as well, which they couldn't identify. They didn't provide any proof of it. Even Microsoft said, "Where's the proof?" And they said, "Just trust us." It's like, no, that's not how it works here.
It's the magic little nodules on their hardware that supposedly can do all this fantastic stuff, but it's completely undetectable.
Yeah, and the fear was that they would spy on people, but the existing infrastructure that's in place, which goes through a lot of the infrastructure is provided by a company called Crypto AG out of Switzerland, which is in part owned by the U.S. government. The current infrastructure does spy on people and allies as well. I mean, remember when Angela Merkel's phone was, bugged, and all of these people that the U.S. was spying on? It's like,
well, some smart analysts,
Huawei. They might do what we're doing. Yeah.
Well, some smart analysts have said probably the real threat Huawei poses is because it's really good technology, is it'll create a whole communications ecosystem that America can't spy on, right? That's the real risk. Edward Snowden, people got to weigh up the Huawei stuff in the context of the Edward Snowden revelations. So it's not just what he revealed about the massive surveillance machinery that's centered in the National Security Agency and its ability to hack into all systems, etc. It goes through that. He has a real insight into the British one, because in the Five Eyes world, Daniel, the fact is that the old experienced imperial master of all this is not the Americans. They're the new kids on the block. It's the British. The British have been the imperial masters for centuries. And Edward Snowden says he talked about how the really serious capabilities were at GCHQ, which is the most secretive intelligence agency in the United Kingdom. GCHQ, it's their signals intelligence. And even they, while we were claiming that Huawei has to be banned on national security grounds, the Brits, for once, were the odd man out in the Five Eyes, because they had. It's like that element of the British government that was just pushing ahead like everyone else was doing, more business deals with China, etc., was caught unawares by this right-wing neoconservative thing that came in to suddenly demonize all of that. And so GCHQ had advanced deals with Huawei where they didn't take them on face value, but they had a deal with Huawei. Huawei built a special lab in the UK for GCHQ, where GCHQ tested every single bit of Huawei hardware and software to verify that it was no threat, as their way of saying, see, this is entirely legitimate to use because we want to use it for our 5G system. And this lab is there. It's a dedicated lab. It tests it all. And they were happy with that system. They were going to go ahead with Huawei. And it was Australia that actually were the ones that came in eventually and really heavied the British when British trade representatives came to Australia. It was Australians who really heavied the British, saying, you're out of line. You're making our anti-Huawei policy look bad. You've got to toe the line. And now the British are, right? It's quite extraordinary. But that chapter alone proves that these claims about Huawei were rubbish.
With TikTok, with Huawei, all indications point towards this being about losing control, losing the ability to do all of the things that they're accusing China of with these things. It's interesting you talk about how more and more people, especially who used to be a part of the establishment, are stepping out to speak out against this. I think, we talked about that a little bit yesterday as well, as when you're out of the system, you can kind of see things a bit more clearly, unless perhaps for some people it was intentional while they were in there. This was just what they had to do. They had to play the game. But these people who have inside information, inside knowledge, or military people who can see how things are playing out, I think they're probably the first ones to see the red flag, saying, whoa, hold on a second. This is moving pretty quickly towards a direction we don't want to go. and maybe it will take a little bit more time, or it needs to become a bit more obvious for ordinary people to then also say, whoa, hold on a second, maybe we should think about this a little bit. Perhaps that's the hope, is we'll get to a point where people are saying, okay, hold on a second, let's reevaluate this, because this is getting scary pretty quickly. And I guess the hope is for us at that point is that it's not too late to put the brakes on it.
Because what's happening is, I can give you two examples that are not to do with China, that actually where that has happened in recent times. And one was the last time they claimed a gas attack in Syria that was used to bomb Syria, and it was entirely baseless. And then more recently under Trump, when there was this beat up about what the ships were doing in the Persian Gulf, and on both occasions, there was a local British commander who, different people who actually in public briefings or television appearances, because the issue was, we're within hours of some form of war. British commanders on the spot broke with the normal way of doing things and spoke out against, forcefully saying, what are we doing this? There's no evidence of what you're claiming. Right? And whether that's influenced by the embarrassment and the shame of Iraq, and I'd like to think it probably is, because the British, their toll wasn't the same as the American death toll, but they actually paid quite a bit in terms of soldiers' lives in that fiasco. Not like can't compare it to the Iraqis, of course, but nevertheless, it was a deeply shameful period of British history. A lot of British people have felt it, including military people, and they spoke up. They speak up because the danger of war is palpable. And that's what, in a more general sense, I think is what's causing people to, in a sense, pick a side on this debate now. And it's true for Russia as well. We're talking about China because of China's, our part of the world. But if you live in America or Britain, especially in Britain, it's all, it's Russia. Russia is the big immediate military threat. And other people go, well, calm down. Where's the evidence, etc.? Because they're far more alarmed of how easily this could turn into a war, and it's making people speak up and pick a side in the debate, and that's useful, and hopefully it works in time.
Yeah, I mean, I guess there's a threshold also. I mean, if there are people out there who have a financial interest in maintaining the status quo, and there are people who push this fear-mongering to, create legitimacy or to create complacency with the system, I hope that they've got at least the moral integrity to, try not to teeter it too close to turning into an actual conflict, and consider the next generation, consider their own kids, and say, okay, listen, maybe it's time we put aside this act, which is designed for whether it be financial purposes or political legitimacy or whatever it is, and just take a step back from this. I mean, I'm just theorizing about what it is that would push people to do this kind of stuff, because some of it is so obviously fake. You know what I want to do is I want to get to the questions that we were providing to Rex. But maybe what we'll do is we'll just take like a 2-minute break or something like that. If people had any questions that you wanted to pop in here, I haven't been looking at the chat this entire time.
I noticed Walters. That's why I thought I'd mention that one.
Yeah, you noticed a comment, or?
Yeah, I noticed Walters a little while ago about Taiwan, which is why I thought Walter Blacks, which is why I thought I'd mention that. You should
okay.
You should make sure you listen to this podcast, Walter, from Singapore.
Right. Yeah, I'm going to provide the link to that afterwards. This live stream will stay up, and while we're waiting for the questions to come through, I'll see if there were some other questions here that came through on YouTube when I specifically asked for it before we knew we were doing a live stream. Let me see what I have here. Is it possible for the Australian politicians to realize that it's going to be for the long-term good for the Australian people if Australia doesn't follow the U.S. to treat China as a potential enemy, but a great natural business partner? I don't know if you had any. We kind of covered that a little bit. If you had any further thoughts on that.
Well, the problem is it is possible. I mean, there was this almost a consensus for the first few years after 2008 that it was only our raw materials exports to China that saved our economy, and that meant China, right? And that culminated in 2014. Xi Jinping came to Australia and addressed our parliament. I mean, and that was under a conservative government, right? It was quite extraordinary. There was a lot more positivity than negativity. So what's happened since, though, is twisted, so our job is to combat the disinformation, and if we can put to rest the disinformation, then that people might be able to see it in those terms again. Not that there's not an argument, as we discussed a little while ago, about Australia being so dependent on China. I mean, we've done dumb things with our economy, but that's not China's fault. That's our fault. But this got twisted as if it was China's fault. And it's the same as America. Trump pretended it was all China's fault. China's raped our economy. Rubbish. Wall Street outsourced to China. China didn't do anything to you. China respects countries' laws, right? They did nothing that America didn't do to it itself. So we had to break through that. I'll give you one example that we've had to take on, and this is at a retail level. This particular issue has probably been more influential in freaking people out about China than anything else. And it was this drumbeat that came through the Murdoch media and things like the Daily Mail from the UK, which has this huge website, right? Daily Mail Australia. It was about Chinese investment in Australia. China's buying up Australia. China's buying up Australia. China's buying up Australia. And it appealed to, unfortunately, there is a racial element in this. To be perfectly frank, it can't be denied. I mean, people do deny it, but I don't think it can be denied. Australians have always had this yellow peril fear that's easily whipped up in them. It's for 150 years. Anyway, China's buying up Australia. And a lot of patriotic people don't like the idea of anybody buying us up, really, right? But they're hearing it's China doing it. And yet that was the single most exaggerated lie in our economic history, because China never got more than the 10th biggest investor in our country. It didn't even break $100 billion in total foreign investment. It's so far below the United States, which is at nearly $2 trillion foreign investment in Australia, right? It's not funny. It's so ridiculous. And we put out, we kept taking on this lie, saying this is just not true. It's just not true. But it's an example of how the media hyped it up. Exactly. Now, in more recent times, people have started, a lot of official bodies have started to acknowledge, China's not the biggest investor, etc. But the line has stuck in people's heads, and it's made them suspicious about why is China buying up all our water, everything else. It's completely exaggerated. So we take it on, and if we can, reason with people and they understand that's not true, and this other thing's not true, and it's not true, hopefully we can get people to focus on the positives.
Absolutely, yeah. We've got another question coming in here from Tusker. With the aggression towards Russia from the U.S., doesn't that pull Russia closer to China and reduce the possibility of an all-out hot war? I mean, so they tried to drive a wedge between Russia and China once again, and Putin's just not having it. I mean, he knows that the U.S. doesn't stick to their agreements. And his interview that he did with, which outlet was it? NBC? He was pretty clear about the friendship. The friendship is really close. I mean, there's probably some concerns about, you saw that there was a British ship trying to sail towards Russia. That was, I mean, an extremely risky incident. So
I think
it's not impossible.
No, it's not. And we've talked about China and Taiwan, and that's definitely a flashpoint. But Ukraine and the Black Sea is equally a flashpoint.
Right.
People don't have to understand the Russian side of this equation. And now what's happening on top of that, and we first noticed this back in 2015, Daniel, where there was a big push at NATO to make cyber attacks a trigger for an Article 5 response by NATO. In other words, cyber attacks are a cause for war, right? And Biden's been talking about this again. And I think it's the most dangerous area of all, because unlike back in the 1840s, I think, from memory, when there was a Mexican war, and a young congressman stood up in the US Congress and gave a very powerful speech about this war with Mexico, and it's called the spot speech. Show me the spot, he said, where Mexico supposedly attacked us to justify this war, because that's what it was based on. And he said, show me the spot. There must be a spot of ground that you can point to that proves this happened. And that congressman's name was Abraham Lincoln, right? Because the great Abraham Lincoln was suspicious about the claims that became pretext for war way back then, as everyone should be for all time. And they could have pushed it to the point of going and showing him the spot. But if you claim cyber attacks now, right, it goes, 99.9999999% of people in the world would never know what the evidence of a cyber attack looks like.
Right.
These things can
just put it out there,
completely contrived, and it's really, really dangerous. And the Brits and the Americans are the ones that have been hyping that sort of stuff up. And what then you got to look at, and Russia's much more vocal on this than China, but there's a reason China's expanding its nuclear arsenal. Look at what the Russians have said for a long time now on this nuclear question, because they've taken every opportunity to make it clear to the Anglo-Americans that they're deadly serious on not on these strategic matters, that making sure they're never going to be left defenseless, right? And it's their last great asset, really, their strategic arsenal. And what they're saying is, you're pushing this into the domain of nuclear war, right? That's a hugely serious thing, and that's the mentality that's made the Russians and the Chinese. So they both see it the same way, because they're not going to back down. I mentioned earlier the fantasists and the Anglo-Americans think that, if we can put enough pressure on them, they'll back down. No, they're not going to back down. Russia lost, 30 million people in World War II fighting fascism. China lost close to the same fighting the Japanese, right? Their national pride, we think we've got national pride. I mean, don't discount their national pride. It's as strong as any country's, perhaps stronger in some respects. They're never going to back down. And so if we keep escalating on these pretexts, it's going to get more serious. But it's also pushing them into this much, much, much closer alliance. Exactly. I think the BRICS was an example of how close, the intention for Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And because that was forming, the West put on this charm offensive against India and Modi, right? And now they're to try and cut Modi out from the pack as a strategic thing, because that's how they think. It's always divide and conquer. So India proved to be the weak member of that. But together, Russia and China are quite strong and of the same mind on these issues.
Right. So to answer the question, it definitely acts as a war deterrent in some ways, but the flashpoints could appear in many other ways. I just don't have confidence in the decision making of Western strategists.
It should be a deterrent, right? By any measure, it should be. But these people are full of fantasies.
Yeah. The Soviets' ability and their weapons. There were certain things that happened that acted as a deterrent during the Cold War, also preventing it from turning into a hot war. And during that time period, America utilized terrorism against the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. They supported the Mujahideen to fight them. I think for the beginning periods, that's what you're going to see here as well. I think there's a strategic reason why they delisted ETIM, the terrorist organization, from the terror list. I think that's why you all of a sudden see people coming out saying, no, they haven't existed for 20 years, even though the U.S. openly admits in 2-3 years ago to bombing them in Afghanistan and bombing them in Syria. There's indications showing that the recent attack that killed 6 engineers in Pakistan and one of the Belt and Road Initiative projects in Pakistan was done by ETIM also. I think you're going to be seeing more of that. And I've got somebody who's... Yeah.
I just want this. One of the reasons, though, it's so dangerous is because in the Cold War, America did compete and outcompete with the Russians economically.
Oh, right.
This time, America can't compete economically. The Chinese
they might get a bit more desperate
all over the world. All they've got is military capability.
Right.
And if you're determined to see the world as a totally fixed, and I have to stay on top, the United States has to stay on top, and all you have is military capability. That's what's making us dangerous. If they had a greater economic capability, they would
Right.
be more confident and they could go and compete in that sphere. But they say they want to. They will have their blue dot network to compete with Belt and Road and whatever. It's all lame rubbish. And they can't. And that's so the strategists that are so desperate, Chinese supremacy, like they can't think of ever sharing the world. If they're no longer unchallengeable at number one, that means someone else is dominating the world. You don't have to think that way, right? Think in more multipolar terms, but they can't. Or the people in charge in Washington can't, and that's where the danger comes from. That they've got a really powerful gun and with a trigger finger, with a head trigger and an itchy finger.
That is the risk, and whether they create some sort of a direct instigation or indirect instigation, it may come through their support through ETIM, especially if a more solid connection is made that the U.S. is absolutely deploying these people. If there's a really direct connection made, that could be a point where at what point does China start retaliating?
Yeah.
I've got somebody who's constantly watching the activities of ETIM and Al Qaeda, who I speak to on a regular basis, and he showed me that ETIM's official WeChat phone number is a California-based phone number. It's based in California. That's the yeah. I mean, I haven't really published that, but I mean. There's some risky stuff going on here. We got a few more super chats that came in. Is there anything that can be done to limit the Murdoch news, media news? Is continuing to poison the Australian mindset? I guess he's saying.
Stop giving him tax breaks. I mean, I sometimes think, what if our party won the election and we were in government? What would we do with the Murdoch media? And you got to take into account the principles of freedom of speech and free press, etc. But there's a but there, and the but is this: we have this very concentrated media, especially print media, in the Murdoch empire. 80% of something is Murdoch, right, and a greater chunk of television. That's evolved over decades, thanks to government policy. We used to have rules up until the 80s, where if you owned the newspaper in town, in a city, you couldn't own the radio stations or the TV stations.
Anti-monopoly kind of...
anti-monopoly kind of stuff. And we came up with excuses to get rid of all that. Well, why? Right? It is not healthy. Well, of course. It's not. You don't like us to be so dependent on China for our economy. You shouldn't like us to be so dependent on Murdoch for our media.
Murdoch.
Right?
Yeah, and
so,
all of your information. Yeah.
Yeah, without jailing him, though I think that's an arguable case given what he did in the Iraq War. No, you need to start instituting some basic anti-monopoly rules, etc. Make them pay tax, and if that drives them bankrupt in the current climate, well, I don't care. Right? It's not up to government to prop these kind of organisations up. What will happen is, because they're all big free market idiots, and I'm not, if Murdoch goes bankrupt because finally the law is applied to him, well, the free market philosophy dictates that alternatives will magically mushroom up and provide the media anyway, right? So no loss. That's all I can hope for. In the short term, we just have to combat it.
You can understand why when and if China starts to open up more on that front in terms of media and information and things like that, there's a precedent set by places like Australia that is cause to approach this very carefully and make sure that the structure of it is developed correctly to not fall into the same issues. Media needs to improve in China, but nobody wants to see it turn out like what you've got there. That's for sure.
Look,
another question that let's go ahead.
I have to sorry to interrupt like this. I'm a democracy believing Australian. I want a free press and all that kind of stuff. But I remember, last year there was a very alarming incident because I'm on Twitter one night and this news broke that supposedly the Taiwanese had shot down a Chinese fighter plane. And I thought, it's World War III. And then I'm looking at Twitter for more information. And all the tweets are coming from half-mad Indian people hyping this up beyond belief. And so I'm looking at what the Chinese side is saying, because there's plenty of Chinese voices on Twitter. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. Right? And I thought, on balance, whatever happened on the Chinese side on Twitter that night was better because it didn't hype a bad situation based on what turned out to be a false account. Right? Because if the China, if it ever did happen, there could be real trouble. This, you want to have freedom of expression, etc. But you got to have some kind of system where you don't let. I mean, Rupert Murdoch, I regard him as a foreign interference agent in Australia. He's not even an Australian citizen anymore. He gets to hype up our country and send us to war, right? And that's in the name of that. That's, to me, that's not free speech. Get out of town, Rupert Murdoch. And that's so that there needs to be some ability to maintain some controls over these rogue media magnates.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, it's dangerous. It's definitely dangerous. There's another question that would be suitable for you, which is from Tommy O. What is the extent of, or is there a wedge growing between Australia and New Zealand because of the difference of opinions about the China approach?
Well, when Scott Morrison went to New Zealand maybe 6 weeks or 2 months ago, it was quite extraordinary because Channel 9 here, which is one of our big commercial channels, which has now taken over all the print media that's not Murdoch, is now owned by Channel 9. So you've got two media organisations, Murdoch and Nine now, and they're just as anti-China as the Murdoch. And the only other alternative is the public one, ABC, and they're all anti-China. But you could see a real example of coordination between the government and the media because Morrison's there trying to talk to Jacinda Ardern about towing the line on China. That's why he was there to pressure her on that. And Channel 9's 60 Minutes program, the Australian 60 Minutes, ran a story about how New Zealand's effectively sold out to the Chinese on trade and they're not backing us up.
Did you see the trailer for that?
Yeah.
Did you see the trailer for that? The trailer for it was comical. It was unbelievable. It's like, they're not our friends anymore. We thought they were our friends in this really dramatic, theatrical, cinematic voice.
And that's, I know. We watched it here in our office and then we watched the show. Anyway, I love the show was terrible, but I love the guy they had on there from the radio guy. He was probably no good really, but he was at least arguing the New Zealand position. And it was totally down to earth and frank. And New Zealanders have a chip on their shoulder about Australia because we're their bigger brother type of thing, right? They love beating us in cricket. I mean, they'll lose to everyone else except to us because they study us and make sure they beat us, just like we like beating the Poms. So they don't like taking crap from us, right? And they say what they think, So that didn't seem to go very well, but it was designed. It was actually this coverage and the way the government's been talking was designed to turn people in Australia against New Zealand. Oh, New Zealand's failed us. No, New Zealand's the only country. Everyone else changed. They didn't. Why would you your best customer keeps coming back to your shop? Why would you start insulting him, calling him all sorts of names without evidence, just to side with the Five Eyes group? And of course, there's a bit of a history of this in New Zealand. In back in the 80s, the Prime Minister then, David Lange, famously wouldn't allow American warships to dock in New Zealand if they were nuclear powered. It was an anti-nuclear thing. But the essence of that, though, was it showed that New Zealand was prepared to be more independent, right, and assert that in certain circumstances. And they're doing that now. And people are trying to drive a wedge, and to Australians, instead of Australians looking at New Zealand and go, well, we should, what they're doing has worked, right? Instead of that happening, instead we're making sure this media machine is making sure New Zealanders have betrayed us somehow.
Right. Yeah.
Oh, and you know yourself what Winston and Dropkick said about the New Zealand foreign minister, who's a Maori with the chin thing, right? And that's
really disrespectful.
Racist dog whistling. No, it's racist dog whistling. We have this term dog whistling where you can't the silent whistle, right? They know what they're doing, right? It's you take an ethnic person and you criticize them, and it's calling on that latent racism that exists in too many white countries, especially the Five Eyes countries, and they're doing it deliberately. And so that a lot of Australians watch that stupid channel ADV a lot, right?
Oh, really?
They get a lot of people I know and I'm on very good terms with. When I talk to them about that, they no, how can you say that? They give great information. Oh God, they just can't.
The sidekick, Beavis, what's his name? Matt. I call him Beavis and Butthead.
Yeah, good. I get it.
He was caught fabricating a Douyin video, putting emojis over top of it, and then doing this dramatic reading of, like, it was completely fabricated. And he platformed a guy who was calling for an ethnic cleansing in Xinjiang after they separated out, saying they'd get rid of all the Mongols and all these people who have been there even longer than the Uyghurs. And then you've got Wolfowitz, one of the architects of the Iraq War, now propping him up. And then he goes on Voice of America, a USAGM outlet, which is the propaganda arm of the CIA, which is its whole purpose is to serve America's foreign policy interests. I actually have a video coming out on that. Yeah.
Look, let me remind people. You could blame all this whole discussion today on Paul Wolfowitz because he did something incredibly dangerous in 1992. They're just on a high from the winning the Gulf War. Wolfowitz, remember, had wanted to follow Saddam back into Iraq, and it was the wiser heads around George H.W. Bush that stopped him. But Wolfowitz was the undersecretary to Cheney. Right, and these are the people who should be in jail for the Iraq War. These people, Wolfowitz, Cheney, right. John Bolton, these kind of people, right? But in 1992, he enunciated what became known as the Wolfowitz Doctrine, and it said then he said it, and Cheney gave it his imprimatur that from now on, American foreign policy would be premised on precluding the rise of any rival military or economic power. In other words, there can be only one. Right, the Highlander principle. And at the time, it was so radical that Joe Biden, then a senator, but a foreign policy expert, the current president, back in 1992, attacked what Wolfowitz said and said, this is a recipe for Pax Americana. You're trying to turn this into American empire. And between 1992 and now, all resistance has dropped, and that is American foreign policy. He enunciated it. And so when Matt gets him on his show, right, I'm just thinking, well, that's all I need to know about you, Matt. Right? You are the YouTube propaganda arm of the empire.
Yeah, I mean, Cheney was Halliburton, right? Halliburton CEO before going into office, resigned from Halliburton as the CEO in 2000 because of the obvious conflict of interest, becoming VP, and then when you look back at the over hundreds of millions of dollars that were passed around to military contractors in the Iraq War, who was one of the biggest beneficiaries? Halliburton. Imagine that.
Cheney,
I mean,
Cheney and Don Rumsfeld go way back together in politics. They were both in the Ford administration, but even before that. And where they got started is they were proteges of this Democratic senator named Henry Jackson. And the people in Henry Jackson's orbit in the 60s and 70s, they became the neoconservatives, right? And yesterday I was mentioning this British think tank, which is entirely British, but they named themselves after this American senator, Henry Jackson. It's the Henry Jackson Society. And what they are is a recipe for permanent war, because the British Henry Jackson Society, they say only, this is their thing, only liberal democracies are legitimate governments. And we who are legitimate liberal democracies are obliged through war, if necessary, to change all regimes into liberal democracies. Right? And one of the founders of this Henry Jackson Society, Brendan Sims, when Libya happened, and at the end of the Libyan War, just after they killed Gaddafi, he crowed in this article he wrote that democracy can be dropped from 10,000 feet. In other words, we can bomb countries into becoming democracies. Well, look what's happened to Libya since. But it's an ideology that these people have that's even bigger than the financial motive, Daniel. I think the financial motive, the military-industrial complex side of stuff, it's there. It's very conveniently there. But the ideology is bigger. What these people talk themselves into believing about the world is very, very dangerous. And that's what Matt had on his show with Wolfowitz. Cheney and Rumsfeld back in the 70s, 60s and 70s, their modus operandi was hyping how much Russia was spending on the military to justify American military spending going up, right? We've got to spend more because the Russians are spending more. And later on, it was revealed that everything I was saying about the Russian military spending was rubbish. It was nowhere near matching America's. All those years, it never matched America's, right? It just became a pretext for matching America's.
Just to clarify, I don't think, unless I'm mistaken, I don't think Wolfowitz was on Matt's show, but Matt was featured by Wolfowitz in his article. He
sorry, no, I know. No, you're right.
Yeah. So, but Wolfowitz, Cheney, Bush, I believe, also was part of a PNAC, a think tank in 1998, who were pushing for regime change in Iraq as early as that. Like this was predetermined even before they got into office. So when these crew of people start propping up new folks for the next aggression, that's when you're like, whoa, hold on a second here. These so-called defenders of human rights are being propped up by yesterday's propagandists and war criminals. And then going on to Voice of America, government propaganda networks and things like that. It's time to start worrying what's going on here. Let's just rip through 3 more quick questions before we go through some of the questions that I had for Rex, and we'll kind of wrap up with that. I know I'm taking you through your lunch. Are you still okay for a little bit there?
Yeah, I'm fine.
With time?
I'm fine.
Okay, good. Yep. All right, so one question from Robert, a regular, a longtime subscriber of mine. Do you think that Australia's current position with China would have been any different under Malcolm Turnbull?
No, because again, it's the difference between what you like when you're in power and what you're prepared to say when you're not in power, right? Look at Malcolm Turnbull's history. Malcolm Turnbull's he became politically famous way back in the 80s because he fought as a barrister, a law case that the Thatcher government had brought against a former head of MI5 who'd moved to Australia. His name was Peter Wright, and he wrote a book called The Spy Catcher, revealing all this stuff that MI5 had done. And it was against the Official Secrets Act. And Malcolm Turnbull he successfully defended that case as a young lawyer on the basis that, well, Peter Wright wrote that book in Australia. We're not bound by the British Official Secrets Act. And then in 2011, he applied the same logic to the Assange case. And he was a government minister then, he was an opposition minister, but he wasn't in government. But he was in Parliament. He was in opposition. He said, "Well, Assange has broken no Australian laws, so we should be making sure that we are defending the rights of our Australian citizens and making sure he comes home. Right? We should not be allowing him to be pursued this way." So he says good stuff. Then he gets into government. Did he do anything for Assange? No, absolutely not. And in fact, what he did was make sure that the China thing, it was under him that the China thing went bad. He goes around now saying, "Oh, we took on it was our initiative to take on Huawei." No, he's a liar. He's a damn liar. Yeah, we took the lead on Huawei under him, but that was entirely backhand under the table stuff from the Americans. Here, you guys take the lead for us. All the experienced people know that. We were doing America's bidding on Huawei. This is a sort of Trump. I don't regard Trump as the worst of them at all. Like, some of his anti-war stuff seemed sincere, but his prejudices were so easy to appeal to, right? This guy is a racist bore, unfortunately, with Donald Trump.
Yeah.
He might prefer business to war, but his prejudice is so easy to appeal to. So he was happy. He wanted he was happy to beat Huawei in a dirty way, and Malcolm Turnbull did that for him. And then it became, Australia's standing up to Huawei, so we've all got to do it. That kind of thing. That happened under Turnbull. And in fact, his number one advisor is a person that we've singled out in this series, the China Narrative series on our website, people can watch, written by Melissa Harrison. His name's John Garneau. He was a foreign correspondent in China. He comes back and rises really rapidly from being a newspaper foreign correspondent to the principal advisor of the Prime Minister under Malcolm Turnbull. A former Prime Minister, Paul Keating, singled him out and said it's all gone to pot since he's been advising the Prime Minister, Malcolm Turnbull. And he said when the intelligence agencies, this is what the former Prime Minister Paul Keating said about this whole China mess. He said, when the intelligence agencies are running your foreign policy, the nutters are in charge. That's what our former Prime Minister said. And he was referring to this guy, John Garnaut, influencing Malcolm Turnbull. And John Garnaut was basically like he's actually a good mate of that, one of those Australians who's detained over there we were talking about yesterday. He's very close to ASIO, John Garnaut, and he was putting up all this rubbish that was influencing Turnbull in this area. And so Morrison's just continued what Turnbull started, right? I don't think it would have been a scary different under Turnbull, even though privately, I know, let me tell you something, privately, right? Malcolm Turnbull talks to people who I talk to and says to them, oh, I don't know why everyone's so anti-China all of a sudden. I'm thinking you started it. And I don't have any confidence it would have been any different. Sorry, am I being cut off? Oh.
Hear me? My connection is getting a little bit fuzzy here. Give me 1
I
second
can hear you
to
now.
sort things out.
I can see you and hear you now. Can people on the stream hear me? I'm cut off from Daniel, but if you hear me, please comment. I'm cut off from Daniel, but if you hear me, please comment. I'm cut off from Daniel.
Can you hear me now over there?
I can, yes.
Okay, sorry about that. I think you got a little bit of an echo going on there. I think
No, I
okay.
just logged on to YouTube to check what was going on.
Okay, yeah. No, I lost my connection. I'm on my 4G now. So let's just let's rip through just a couple more here. There was one that's out of the history now, which was asking. There was a thank you note to you, and also asking how can they support your party.
I just go to www.citizensparty.org.au, or if you're in Australia, you can even call us and talk to someone. Our toll free number is 1-800-636-432. But if you go on our website, you can see how you can support us.
Perfect. Okay. And yeah, thank you everybody else for the super chats and stuff like that. So what we'll do is we've gone completely off from our original topic of the the interview, but that's okay. We covered a lot of really interesting stuff here. So the original premise, again, was holding to account some of these senators who are going full on with the anti-China narrative, particularly Rex Patrick, who's going full on with this Xinjiang genocide narrative. So I covered some of the questions in yesterday's episode, and I'll mention some of the other ones I had asked him, which I didn't receive an answer to. So we have... So in terms of the forced labor, because I'm not going to get into the issues with the forced labor report again. That was either earlier in this episode or the past episode. But one of the questions I asked him was, how worried are you, and what considerations did you make about taking away real jobs and the livelihoods of Uyghurs based on faulty information and conclusions? If so, can you point me to where I can find these questions and concerns being raised? I ask this because there are a lot of other people raising these questions, and I haven't seen anybody answering them. I asked if you turn out to be incorrect. So these were directed towards Rex Patrick again. If you turn out to be incorrect but manage to push through major sanctions on Xinjiang, are you willing to take responsibility for the harm caused, or would you consider it fair for Uyghurs who lost their jobs to hold you legally accountable? Then perhaps more important, several studies have shown that the lack of employment creates an environment conducive to extremism and radicalization. Uyghurs were targeted for radicalization by Salafist Islamist groups and ETIM, many of whom drew once moderate Muslim Uyghurs into conflicts fighting alongside al-Qaeda in Syria. Operatives within Xinjiang targeted and attacked not only Han Chinese, but Uyghurs not conforming to their ideologies. If your efforts are successful, you will potentially create an environment in which it's easier for terrorism to return. Have you considered this? Have you considered the human impact of your actions on the other side of this balance sheet? And what do you suggest the Chinese government does when and if this happens? This is a really important, relevant question, because when the U.S. delists ETIM as a terrorist organization, when they're trying to sanction Xinjiang and take away jobs from people, the World Bank and all of these, there's a number of studies that show these are the environments that are conducive to promote recruiting people into terrorism. When you consider that, when you radicalization, when you consider that the ETIM's main number is hosted in California, when you consider all of this stuff, people are trying to whitewash these groups. It looks like that's what's going on. It looks like that's exactly what the intent is to allow these a resurgence of these groups, and you get a lot of really suspicious whitewashing of what the ETIM did before. As you mentioned yesterday as well, Robbie, what China faced was many more times worse than what France experienced, and everybody was empathizing with France, but nobody's empathizing with, at least in no significant way.
It's never mentioned. It's virtually never mentioned in the context of the de-radicalization program that started in 2017. That up until 2017, in a decade, they had a wave of terrorist attacks that killed 800 people. I mean, I have friends in Australia who, when there's been one person in the streets of Melbourne commit a terrorist attack that's killed one person, have called for, and these are people I know and like, have in a fit of rage and indignation have called for all Muslims to be deported from Australia. And those same friends think that China's bad for trying to de-radicalize the Uyghurs.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. I mean, yeah, and right, and I mean, the full story isn't getting to them as well on that front. That other Uyghurs are being attacked by these groups as well. It's not this, clear. People think that, well, these kinds of terrorism issues, they don't happen in a vacuum. It must be because they're oppressed and all these kinds of things. Well, actually, you know what? That same kind of rhetoric, saying that, unrealistic or taking criticism too far of Islam or Uyghurs, that stuff is not allowed in China. That stuff is blocked. That's the opposite of what you would do if you're trying to genocide a culture and a group of people. You allow the villainization of them, but actually they protect them. But in terms of addressing the issue of these things don't happen in a vacuum, I mean, look at the neighboring countries. These things are happening, as I mentioned yesterday, in Kyrgyzstan also, in the south.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, no worries. In Kyrgyzstan in the south, from what I've seen, it's mostly the Uzbek kind of ethnic group in the south who also want to set up a caliphate. These things do happen. People are radicalized into these ideologies.
Actually, can I just say something? Because
Right. Yeah.
that was a bit rude. That's my friend on the other side of that wall. Because we've been at this for a long time, so he was just seeing if I'm finished yet. He's an Iraqi. He's an Assyrian, Iraqi Assyrian, which means he's a Christian. And he grew up in Iraq under Saddam's rule. And it was a totally safe environment. As a member of the smallest minority, the Syrian Christians in Iraq, it was a totally safe environment. Because of Western regime change, now he fled after the first Gulf War and became a refugee and came to Australia. And when the Iraq War happened, he was working in our office with us. And because of regime change, his country got turned into an ISIS hellhole, right? And it's through his eyes, partly, that I'm able to see this, because I've had a sheltered Australian upbringing. I haven't been to these countries, right? He's lived it. His country was destroyed by this agenda. And when we talk about how they can get away with whitewashing ETIM, Daniel, they've got away with whitewashing this kind of terrorism going back to the late 1970s with Zbigniew Brzezinski recruiting the Mujahideen to fight the Russians, right? And there's two Hollywood movies at least, The Living Daylights, the James Bond movie, and Rambo 3, that glorify the essentially Al-Qaeda in those movies because they're the anti-Russians, and Americans just swallowed that. Yeah, when the Twin Towers attack happened, etc., and people started learning about Al-Qaeda, there was quite a few Americans and Brits and Australians that took stock and thought, oh, they learned something. Oh, we actually played a role in promoting these people that have now turned around and attacked us. But it was a shorter time after that didn't seem to matter when we just let those literally the same organizations with the same names. I mean, it was still Al-Qaeda. We just let them loose in Iraq and Syria and Libya to unleash their mayhem. And the whole world has ignored the truth of that. And now we're trying to tell them it's the same crowd in Xinjiang with this ETIM. We know the American military knows we're right. The guys who actually have to get on the ground and fire bullets at them, they know we're right. But the American State Department and the intelligence agencies, they've been able to lie that it doesn't even exist.
It's amazing that we, and Jack James was talking about this also, where it's an amazing thing where you are fooled by something, or there's a piece of propaganda put in front of you which you know better about, and you say, well, this is totally fake, but then you turn the page and in the same newspaper you literally believe the next story, and it's a kind of a continuation of what was going on. I saw that as well with Australia was trying to blame China on the classification of the Great Barrier Reef as, that it should be put on a danger list. And there were real climate scientists and climate lawyers in Australia that came out and said, well, that's complete BS. You had that
was extraordinary.
Go ahead. Yeah.
It was just a way that they could, again, the right wing just believed it. Because as soon as they said it was China, then, oh, yeah, of course, they're trying to attack us.
Right, yeah. But when you get these experts that come out that know better and saying, hold on a second, there's a biostatistics guy, a professor in Japan also, who says, well, this sterilization report, this forced sterilization or population control is completely bogus. It doesn't make sense, and that's his expertise. You get these different people coming out who see through it. And I was hoping that would be a catalyst for them saying, whoa, hold on a second. We should take a step back and consider the entire narrative and say that if they're lying about this in terms of the China story, what else are they lying about? But I think what's probably more likely, I'm not saying that this really happened for these people, but probably what's more likely in the real world is, again, they turn the page and they're like, oh, wow, China's doing that. It's no longer an area of their expertise. But yeah,
it gets more ridiculous and bizarre, because yesterday you and I spent a bit of time talking about how the 2016 online census in Australia collapsed under ordinary traffic because a router wasn't turned on properly, and that was blamed on a Chinese hack which everyone knows was bogus, right? But people like ASPI kept saying it was a Chinese attack. That was 2016. The census is every 5 years. So it's now 2021. Tomorrow night, we all have to do the census. And guess what I saw on television this morning? A serious discussion between the host and an expert. How can we protect this census from being attacked? There was no attack 5 years ago. No government would bother to attack a census. As the real expert said, why would they bother? Yet still, and this was Sky News, which just pumps out more anti-China. This is Murdoch than anyone.
Yeah. It's the same thing, like, with Pompeo still going with the international flights from Wuhan story. They're debunked. You just wait long enough and you bring it back out again, and only a select few people will know, well, hold on a second, that was debunked already.
Debunking doesn't matter in a political climate.
Right.
The political climate determines what people believe, not the facts of the case. And so he knows he can run with that, and he does.
Right. I'm going to quickly reset my connection again, but while I'm doing that, you can answer one question. I'm just going to need about 20 seconds or so, but maybe you can answer this question from Benny Wu. Do any individual Australian states have significantly different positions on China? How possible it is to go against the federal government? Probably it's really, it's a good point to maybe mention the Victoria situation on that too. Then I'll let you answer that as I'm resetting my connection here.
Okay. So yes, the states have significant differences on China, and the two states that are the most different are Western Australia and Victoria. In Western Australia, it's because it's the biggest state in territory over on the west, and its whole economy revolves around the iron ore trade. Without that trade, they don't have an economy in Western Australia, and that's actually not good, but that's just the reality of it. So the government of Western Australia, just like they took extreme measures to protect the iron ore trade from COVID outbreaks, they also very firm in standing up to the federal government and going, what madness is this? And when a federal government minister a few months ago, Peter Dutton, came out backing a top bureaucrat talking about the drums of war, it was the WA Premier, Mark McGowan, who took them on. And then when the G7 happened, our Prime Minister went over for it. He flew to Perth first, met the Premier there, then flew to Singapore, and then flew to Europe. In Perth, the Premier took him on to his face and told him to cut the crap about stoking the China threat. In Singapore, he met I don't know how to pronounce Lee Kuan Yew's son's name very well, but the Prime Minister there, Lee, who gave him good advice on cooling his jets on China, and then he goes to the G7 and joins up with the Americans and Brits and is able to stoke the flames on China again. So yeah, it is the state governments. The Premier, Mark McGowan, has done a pretty good job. He's the most forceful. In Victoria, it's a bit different because we're the one state. I'm in Victoria. We're the one state that signed a Belt and Road Agreement with China, and when we did, it was in the context where everyone. This was welcomed with open arms in Australia at the time. Our current Prime Minister welcomed it with open arms. One of the most effusive quotes about the Belt and Road came from his lips in June 2019. Right, we welcome what the Belt and Road's doing in the region. He signed an agreement with China on the Belt and Road. Our current Prime Minister, when he was Treasurer, signed an agreement with China on the Belt and Road for Australia to participate as a third party in projects in other countries. So our Premier in Victoria, Dan Andrews, signed a Belt and Road Agreement, and it's just a totally motherhood statement. It's not an actual contract. It gives China no claim over Victoria or Victoria any claim over China. It's a statement of goodwill. Nothing in it's enforceable, but because that creates a sort of a framework where, because China wanted countries to sign up, right? New Zealand signed up, Israel signed up, all these hundreds, the majority of countries in the world signed up to Belt and Road, right? But Victoria did as well. Now, people thought, so what they did is Mike Pompeo was asked on a live television appearance in the middle of last year by some conservatives who hate the Victorian Premier for all sorts of reasons, just because they're conservative. They used this as something to raise to Mike Pompeo, and Mike Pompeo made a threat. He said, if we think what one of your governments is doing is a security threat, we'll cut off intelligence sharing with you. And as if they were shot, they jumped to attention, rushed this law through Parliament that gave the federal government the power to override a state signing these kind of agreements. And the agreement is, I mean, it's nothing. It's pretty weak. It's just a friendly trade agreement. And our states are allowed. I mean, the states pre-existed the federation. They're older than federation, right? They're not bound by all the Australian Constitution. They do have their right to come up with sister city arrangements and engage in areas that's in the foreign policy sphere without actually representing all of Australia. But as long as it's in these areas of economics, etc., they've done it their whole existence. And suddenly, because Mike Pompeo said so, our law has been passed that now states can't do that. And the question is whether they'll. Right. We hope they'll take it up in the High Court and challenge the constitutionality.
Yeah. Pompeo was flying all around. I mean, he made a threat to Israel also, saying that they might have to reevaluate their relationship.
That's foreign interference. That is naked, transparent foreign interference. Yet no one questions that.
That's allowed.
That's coercion. That we like accusing China of coercion because they're taking their business somewhere else. Well, that's coercion.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. So then going on to the other questions that I had asked Rex Patrick in the email that he said he would respond to was if the Uyghurs fighting with Al-Qaeda and ETIM in Syria were to return to China, they'd likely be detained. Do you believe this is reasonable or would you be willing to accept them in Australia? I think that question is a little bit loaded, but it's based in fact. Everybody knows that there are thousands of Uyghurs in Syria. But perhaps to deload that question, just in general, why aren't these countries coming out with programs to accept as many Uyghur refugees as they want? Like, if they really think this genocide is going on, why aren't they doing that? I'll answer first, and then you can say it's either they know that nobody's coming, nobody wants to leave, everybody's fine, and they're getting along with their lives, or B, they know they'll end up with a lot of people who really are radicalized and fighting with these groups. They know that they exist, and they know that the challenge is real, but they can't admit it on paper, and they can't say, okay, we're opening up our borders to all Uyghurs to come in, whatever Uyghurs want to come in. Well, what is your take on that?
We are a country that's so afraid of our own shadow now that we have removed the citizenship of actual Australian citizens who went to Syria to fight with ISIS or just marry people who fought with ISIS, right? And we're denying them their Australian citizenship so they can't come back here. And it's actually quite terrible. There's a whole bunch of women and kids in Syria in these refugee camps that are Australians, and they're no threat to us. It's absolute rubbish. They should be able to come back here, but we deny them that. And we think that the Australian people are going to be happy accepting radicalised Uyghurs with open arms. When this first came up, I remember in 2018, I was in Parliament House for other matters, and there was a Uyghur delegation. It was all over the place. So when you're in Parliament lobbying, you sort of see the other groups that are there. And this was clearly a Uyghur group. Uyghur stuff was on the news. Politicians were speaking up in Parliament about Uyghur stuff, and I could see the groups there going around and having these meetings with politicians, and politicians some were starting to use the word genocide, etc. And I pointed out to people, okay, if what you're saying is so bad, here's the irony of these Australian politicians speaking up in their defence, because if those poor tortured Uyghurs fled China and heard that Australia supports them, but logistically could only come to Australia by boat, and so had to endure hardship to get to the coast somewhere, get on a boat, get to Indonesia, pay a people smuggler, which is usually just a poor fisherman who gets demonised as a people smuggler, to use their boat to get them across to the mainland. Do you know what Australia would do to them? By law, without exception, lock them up on an island prison and throw away the key. We have a policy that nobody, doesn't matter what doesn't matter what their claim is, nobody is allowed to come to Australia by boat. We would put them in a camp, right? We have a terrible refugee. This is one of my issues, Daniel. The way we treat refugees is awful. We're the emptiest country in the world, and we're the scaredest country in the world about being flooded by bloody refugees, yet we support all the wars that cause the refugees, right? We could probably change that policy if we don't want refugees. But no, instead we have this onerous policy that imprisons them indefinitely to send a message to all others, don't come. And yet we claim that we would be friendly to Uyghurs. Well, it turns out, I want to show you a picture here. This is from this article I was mentioning.
All right.
This is one of these Uyghur delegations in our parliament. So the man second from my left, I think that's the same for you guys, sitting down, is Andrew Hastie. He's an assistant defence minister. And the man beside him that he's holding hands with, to his right, is the head of the East Turkestan Australian Association. And this guy, I forget his name, Nur Muhammad Majid. He makes all these claims about East Turkestan, etc. And so he's the guy that's in Rex Patrick's ear. He's in these other politicians' ear with him and his association. Makes some very racist claims as well. He calls the Chinese people the bloodthirsty and insatiable people of China. So he's sort of living proof that when they say, "Oh, it's only the CCP we don't like, not the Chinese people," he has no compunctions. It's the Chinese people. But what's his job? He's an immigration agent. So he helps Uyghurs get visas. And how do you help Uyghurs get visas to come to Australia? You just tell how persecuted they are.
Right.
His business. This is a business. His business. He makes money getting Uyghurs to come to Australia. And he's the main guy in charge of the main association that's hyping the genocide in Xinjiang. So there's a bit of a conflict of interest there, shall we say. And
right.
Australians, there is no flood. There's absolutely no flood of refugees coming to Australia, absolutely for sure. But there's enough of a trickle of Uyghurs coming here thanks to the claims that this guy's making on behalf of his association.
They should just open up. They should open up the floodgates. I think pushing that idea would really force their hand to admit that, okay, well, there really is an issue. I remember talking to, there's one, a journalist who recently won an award on one of the pieces she did on Xinjiang about reconstructing the buildings to show that they can hold 1 million people or something like that. And when I was asking her, she said ETIM doesn't exist. There aren't radicalized Uyghurs. And then when I showed her videos of kids being trained in ISIS-built camps, when I showed her, a video of the U.S. military doing airstrikes on ETIM in 2018, and I asked about the Uyghurs who are in Syria, this is what she said. She said, as for Uyghurs in Syria, they ended up there after being unable to stay in Turkey, and they found themselves having to fight as a result. They're better described as mercenaries than terrorists or ideologues. I was like, wait, hold on a second. These are people, like, they're doing beheadings and stuff like that. Like you were talking about Christians in Iraq. The same thing in Syria. Not only Christians in Syria, but Muslims who don't close their shops on Fridays and don't go to pray. We're talking about like serious beheadings and stuff like that, and saying, it's just because they didn't have anywhere else to go. No, they escaped they went to Malaysia. They were given fake Turkish passports. They arrive in Turkey. These terrorist groups are at the airport. They pick them up and they ferry them right over to Syria to carry out a jihad. That's what's going on. And if they don't believe that's what's going on, and they really think that these Uyghurs are just stuck in limbo in Turkey and nobody's accepting them, well, the first question is, why is nobody from the West picking them up? If they know this is going on, why aren't the West, if they care about the Uyghurs so much, they should be stepping up to the plate and giving them an option so that they don't go to Syria? Or is it they know that they're there specifically to go to Syria?
Well,
they're already part of this.
Do you know who knows this better than anybody? Is the East Turkestan Australian Association and the East Turkestan government in exile. They know exactly why there's Uyghurs in Syria. Now, again, apologies. I'm just going to. I'll read it out in a sec. But this is. I'm going to read you this tweet here.
Okay.
Now it's this one at the bottom.
Underneath.
I'm going to read this tweet. All right, this is December 16, 2017, by Saleh Hudayar, who is the Prime Minister of the East Turkestan government in exile, and he's based in Washington. He tweeted in response to a Turkish journalist saying, "Oh, you've got it."
I just loaded it now.
There you go. People can read it. It's quite sad. So this, I mean, my view, I don't know if you have different information, but essentially the Turkestan Islamic Party is an ETIM of the same entity. So this journalist reported they were fighting, and he said, it's quite sad to see the majority of Uyghur fighters are naive and think they are fighting in the path of Allah, when in reality they are fighting for interests of foreign governments. That's true. That supply them with the funding and arms, whereas their real enemy lies in East Turkestan. So he's acknowledging everyone knows they're terrorists, and he's saying they should be doing what they're doing, not in Syria, but in East Turkestan. He's calling essentially for terrorism in Xinjiang in that tweet. Well, as the rest of that, this is from this article that we did about Rex Patrick and these people boosting these guys. Again, apologies, but this is young Drew Pavlu with Saleh Hudayar in New York a couple of years ago, joining forces together to carry on about the East Turkestan issue at the United Nations. And Saleh Hudayar is all over the East Turkestan Australian Association website, right? They have a close relationship with him. So this is why we say that these Australian politicians, they are aiding and abetting terrorist sympathizers. Well, I don't say the ETAA is terrorist, but they sympathize with terrorists, i.e. the ETIM, Turkestan Islamic Party, etc. Yeah. This is Drew Pavlu and Saleh Hudayar. That's Rex Patrick up the top there.
So there's a couple of reasons why obviously they're not. There's this great genocide going on, but nobody's opening up their borders to the Uyghurs, like creating a policy saying all and any Uyghurs can come here. You're persecuted if you're displaced outside of China, come to our Western countries immediately. One is because they know why they left to begin with. They know what they're involved in, and two, they want them to go back and fight. These governments who are arranging themselves in this geopolitical way, they want them to go back to Xinjiang and do this again. And it all goes together with the ETIM being delisted as a terrorist organization. One of the reasons they said was that because they don't exist anymore and they haven't existed for 20 years. Well, we can see that, like I said, even a couple of years ago, they were acknowledging them and bombing them. But the other thing too is that Is that a good enough reason to remove them off of the terrorist list? If they were a terrorist organization but they no longer exist, well, why haven't you removed the Tamil Tigers off of the terrorist list? They haven't been in operation for decades now in Sri Lanka.
Format, it's exactly what they did, like I said, in Libya and Syria, right, where they denied it was Al Qaeda, and there was a movement in Australia, in Britain, other countries, France. One of the worst was in France, but in Britain, I know the British one very well. The British MI6 stood by and probably assisted radical preachers in Britain, especially this guy Anjem Chowdhury. He recruited at least 500 jihadis to go to Syria and Libya and fight against the Great Satan, or whatever they called it there, right? To go and be terrorists. But why would MI5 be involved? Because their objective was essentially the same as the British government's objective. Overthrow Assad, right? And in Libya, the people that actually helped to get to Libya came back and did the Manchester bombing.
And the Ariana Grande,
That's right, in Manchester. And the London Bridge attack.
Right, yeah. And these were people who were under house arrest before. They were not allowed to leave. They didn't need them in Iraq. They wanted to go to Iraq to fight a jihad, but they didn't let them go to that one. I think they had that under control. They didn't need any more of them there. But as soon as Libya opened up as an option, they said, you're no longer under house arrest. You're no longer disallowed from leaving the country. And some of them even got ferried back on military ships. And then these people are not your These people are not your friends.
Suspected terrorists in Britain went to Syria and Libya to become moderate rebels, and then they took what they really were back to Britain. There was about 200 Australians recruited for Syria,
Yeah.
right, to join ISIS. And we looked into that a bit. I'm suspicious of our intelligence agency's role here because it's just continuing what they started back in Afghanistan in the late 70s, the same method.
Right.
And they absolutely, what happened, I took note a couple of years ago, there was around Christmas time, there was a couple of young Muslim guys just north of me here in the north suburb arrested for supposedly threatening a terrorist attack in Australia. And it was breaking news, and I had time to get on their website, or their Facebook page, because I saw their name. And it was all anti-Syria propaganda, things that I knew were just lies about Syria. Their Facebook page was full of it. That's what had radicalized them. So when you're hearing all this stuff now, I've been very conscious as Daniel, when you're hearing all this stuff about what China is supposedly doing to Uyghur Muslims, it has a radicalizing effect on the Muslim population, and it's designed to, and it will be probably the only thing that's intervened from already in terms of it being a mass migration of terrorists to China. Unfortunately, is the pandemic, which is really interfered with people's travel. Because if it wasn't for the pandemic, with all this hyping, you would have an army massing up there, right, on the border. But the difference is China is not Libya or Syria. And
yeah. That's actually a point that I was trying to make in the last episode, but I didn't end up finishing that point, is that a lot of the propaganda that's being used against China in terms of the Uyghurs is recycled jihadist propaganda. It's from the Al-Qaeda playbook. It's from these, these were used before. And this is one of the reasons a lot of Muslim countries as well don't buy into it, because they've seen this before. They're like, we've seen this before. In Egypt, it happened as well. The forced sterilizations and all this stuff. And actually, to this day, Christians are unable to teach in, I think it's either all universities or a certain university, obstetrics, because of that rumor that they were forcefully sterilizing Muslim women, or that the government was destroying mosques, and this was within a Muslim country to begin with as well. And these were the stories that were used to radicalize Muslims. Now that happened within their internal networks and things like that, but the difference is this time is Western media is helping to prop up this jihadist propaganda now, which is acting as a rallying call all around the world. When you consider also that ETIM is now delisted from the terrorist organization, it's no longer illegal for them to fundraise, or people who are donating US dollars to them don't have to worry about getting penalized anymore. This whole network,
HSBC won't be fined for laundering its money.
No, to ETIM, it's not a terrorist terrorist organization anymore. It's so easy to see what's going on here, and it's so dangerous. Now the benefit, though, so the reason they can't take these guys from Turkey is because they know, we know why they're there. And they saw what happened when you use jihadis that are living in your own country to go and fight against a regime that you don't like in Libya. When they come back, they continue their jihad at home, because this is an ideological issue. And I like to separate it from religion also, because this isn't a religious issue per se. This is an ideology that is taken too far. There are so many moderate Muslims who are affected by this as well, including in Xinjiang. But as soon as they accept these guys from Turkey, and they become Australians or Canadians or Americans or British, when they're finished fighting Assad in Syria and they come home, all of a sudden it becomes their problem. But they want it to become China's problem. I mean, the most obvious thing. Yeah, the most obvious thing to do would be to open up your borders to them if you really think this is going on, and you really think there's nothing nefarious going on.
No, of course. Then Andrew Hastie wouldn't be so popular with the government here if he tried to claim that. He's someone who called for Islam to be reformed a few years ago. And now he's hosting these terrorist sympathizers in Parliament. So, and we put that out. If the Chinese Foreign Ministry quoted our article, and then it got a little bit of press coverage in Australia, but otherwise it got none. Should be a huge scandal, but it got none. Just a little bit of a plug here. On our website, we have a very lengthy report on the Xinjiang issue.
Oh, it's good, yeah.
Very, very detailed, but it covers before. It starts at the beginning of time. If you remember the opening, it's describing the geological history of the region that makes it unique. But it essentially covers the 40 to 50 year recent period, and how the reason there's this consistency in this method. And not just in Xinjiang, but across Libya and Syria, etc., is because it's actually one strategy that a British guy named Bernard Lewis first enunciated, called the arc of crisis. That this is the underbelly of the Soviet Empire, and China can be undermined by radicalizing the Muslim people and now the Turkic Muslim people in the underbelly of that, and they've just used that method again and again and again. Interestingly, some of the CIA agents we name has been involved in it and advocating it over a long period of time. I think his name's Graham Fowler. Someone will kick me for getting that wrong if it's wrong, but he was involved in it. He's recently joined this group of contrarian and ex-intelligence agencies in America called Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, because it's got so bad in America now that there are people that are breaking away from the foreign policy establishment and actually calling out the lies, and that tends to be coalesced around this group. And one of these guys is actually now in that. I think it's Fowler. I probably got that wrong, but yeah, it's if you got the time and you're interested in the subject, you can see that on our website. It's a great big report about Xinjiang. It's worth reading.
I'll put it in the description afterwards as well. Yeah, I mean, these are definitely the things that people need to pay attention to. The guy that I was talking about who was involved with these groups before, he has an absolute distaste for the Western foreign policy and still really kind of has major issues with it, of course. And he sees through this how Muslims are continually being weaponized over and over again to serve Western geopolitical interests, and it outrages him, and he wants to get some more of this information out as well to let people know about it. But again, that's why when we were seeing that list of 21 or 22 countries that were condemning China's policy in Xinjiang, it got no coverage that there were 54 countries that actually supported China, and a lot of them were Muslim countries. And people, even though they're pretending to respect and care about Muslims, they said, well, that's because they're corrupt. They're just corrupt countries. It's actually because they can see through this propaganda. They know, first of all, what they're dealing with, how when these ideologies spread, how serious it is, and also the kinds of propaganda that was used before to prop this kind of stuff up. And I mean, we're equipped with enough information in the West. It's out there for us to be made aware of this as well. But just people are, going along with it. Now, going on to, so I have a video. Let me see if I have it on this as well. So I sent him a copy of a video. I said, there are also children being trained in camps built by ISIS. See attached video. If they found their way into Australia, how would you feel about putting them into de-radicalization programs or through something similar or some sort of probation programs that would put people through community service and job placement schemes? Now, let me see if in my StreamYard from before I think I do. I'll show you a little bit of that video of what I sent him. Let me see here. Kids, propaganda, ISIS praising ETIM, new ETIM propaganda video. Oh, here we go. The
video also featured young Uyghur school children shouting threats to the Chinese government.
Oh, is it showing up for you?
Yaşlanğan gözler, boğulğan sözler, izzətdə bugün qəmlənən yüzlər. Yaşlanğan gözlər, boğulğan sözlər, izzətdə bugün qəmlənən yüzlər. Hər yerdə təkbir, olğaçqa səbir, titrəməkdə tağut.
You get the idea. It wasn't showing up on the screen from you. That's real. That's real stuff that's going on there. So what do? If you want to bring these people in? And it's interesting because Vice did a documentary. Vice did a coverage on Xinjiang, and they also did coverage in Indonesia, which does have de-radicalization programs for children of terrorists. And it was amazing to see how Vice covered it differently. In Xinjiang, dark images, dark music. In Indonesia, it was this cheerful music about a second chance for these kids, and they didn't use de-radicalization. They used de-brainwashing. They said they're de-brainwashing them, and so that's a real issue. What do you do with kids that went through programs like that? And my question was designed to provoke some thought around that.
Whereas he would know, like I mentioned earlier, there's women and children in these horrible refugee camps in Syria who, these women have Aussie accents, right? They grew up here. They're Aussies. They were sucked into going over there because to marry some guy, have a few kids. Their husbands are invariably dead or in prison. They desperately want to come home. Their families are campaigning to get them. Their families were shattered. They lost their daughters over there, right? Now they're happy they're still alive. Come home, bring the grandkids home. And our government won't let that happen. We're so scared of them, those little kids. Our government won't let that happen. And either one or two things will happen with these ETIM kids. Like in that video, they'll either not be allowed in, proving the hypocrisy of our position, or if they'll be allowed in and these Australian kids won't be allowed in because these ETIM kids are called refugees, that would be completely immoral and disgusting. And it just proved, how morally vacuous the government's position is.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's why these are questions he can't answer, because the implications of even acknowledging this as an issue has some uncomfortable consequences for him.
Yeah.
These are undeniable facts. I mean, in his response to my question, which was saying, "Oh, it's more opinion than it is question, or it's more commentary." No, I have real questions for you, Rex Patrick, and we know why you can't answer this. It's obvious. It completely destroys your position.
He's run out on an anti-China limb with no clothes on.
Right.
And it's not a good look, Rex.
Right. So, and this I covered yesterday a little bit too. I said ASPI or ASPI. I always have the habit of calling it ASPI. I know you guys call it ASPI, but whatever. ASPI, the source of much.
This way, an asp is a snake.
Yeah.
Right. So that's why we call it ASPI.
Yeah.
They speak with a forked tongue.
Well, I prefer ASPI as also because, I mean, it sounds like ass, and then P is like the Chinese word for fart. So it's like ass fart. So I would like to get in the habit of calling them ASPI or ass fart more often. but so let's see here. So then the next question was, ASPI, the source for much of the forced labor accusations against China are ironically funded by weapons manufacturers using exploitative forced prison labor programs. Will efforts be made to address this, and will the bill be worded to encompass these companies? Would you consider sanctions against the U.S. if they don't put an end to these practices? Fair question. He wants to sanction China for doing this with no evidence. The U.S. is not only doing it, I mean, this is so many layers of just mind blown. The U.S. is not only doing it, the company that's providing you with the information saying China's doing it is funded by companies who are relying on forced labor and prison labor. So he didn't obviously answer that. No. That's a good time to pull up this image as well. Forced labor. There we go. So there's the list right there. I think this was done by Marcus as well, right?
Yeah, this is Marcus Rubenstein.
Marcus Rubenstein does amazing work on tearing apart ASPI.
Look up APAC News, APAC News. It's a good news service that Marcus has.
Yeah, if you're watching, Marcus, apologies I didn't give you credit for this yesterday. This is a great work that you put together here. So the other obvious question about the general narrative is, how do you explain there's no flood of Uyghur refugees crossing the several borders surrounding Xinjiang if the situation is as bad as think tanks and human rights groups claim? So no answer to that. How do you feel about the testimonies coming from alleged concentration camp survivors who left China legally on their passports through China exit customs, some of whom had their passports renewed by the Chinese government after they escaped the camps? Can you provide any logical reason as to how this makes sense? He didn't answer that. Again, keep in mind, they agreed that they would answer my questions by email, and his general response to everything that he didn't respond to was that those are commentary, not questions. No,
Yeah.
that's a genuine question. Can you help me, Rex? Can you help me understand how that is possibly logical?
The question shows that your position is one that's not based on fact, and that's why he couldn't engage. I mean, I'm saying it to him. His position is one that's not based on
Exactly. ASPI makes its way into the China conversation in Australia quite frequently, considering that they are funded by the U.S. government and worse weapons manufacturers who directly profit from ratcheting up China threat stories. Do you see any cause for concern with this conflict of interest? Then I ask directly, I say, during a hearing, and I'll play the clip for this, during a hearing, you asked James Leopold. Am I pronouncing his name correctly?
Leibold.
Bold
liar.
Yeah. Leibold. Why he wasn't appearing as ASPI. See attached video. He seemed to stumble and not really give a clear answer. You were prepared to move on. However, Eric Abetz seemed to intervene and suggest a better answer for James, to which he responded, he should have had that line ready to wheel out. And I do remember my bosses at ASPI reminding me of that. Eric seemed to be feeding and reminding James of ASPI management-approved wording and lines. What do you think is going on here, and do you see any cause for concern? That was amazing. That was amazing. I've got that video here. I'm gonna play. Yeah. For some reason, it shows up delayed on my screen. So if the video finishes and I'm not talking, it's because it's a bit of a delay here. So let me see here. This is awesome. Here we go.
Right, thank you. I might just switch to locally to ASPI and former ASPI. Can I just ask, the reason you're not appearing as ASPI today, Professor, is simply that Ms. Zhu has moved to the ABC, or what's the reasoning for not connecting with ASPI today?
No, I mean, I do. I'm partially employed by ASPI, so in some regards, I appear before the committee with that title, as well as my title at La Trobe. I prefer to speak for myself, so my remarks don't necessarily represent those of ASPI or its employees. These are my personal remarks, and that's for me. I don't know, Vicky, you want to explain?
Well, I've departed from ASPI, so I'm just an independent journalist, writer now.
That was the reason I directed it at you, Professor. Just in relation to, firstly, I might congratulate you on the report.
Senator Patrick, can I just quickly intervene here and ask ASPI, or the people that have been associated with ASPI, that as I understand it, ASPI never has a corporate view on issues. They always appear as individuals. Is that correct?
That's correct, Senator Betts. And
I should
have had that line ready to wheel out. But I do remember my bosses at ASPI reminding me of that, and so hence why, my remarks are personal. But I am still associated with ASPI. I'm still partially employed there as a senior fellow.
Senator Patrick.
That is extraordinary. It's the weirdest exchange in the history of the Australian Parliament committee process. ASPI, like those of us and seemingly everybody on this watching this live show, knows what ASPI is. It's quoted all over the world. Yet ASPI tells its people when they go to Parliament they're not representing ASPI. ASPI doesn't have a corporate view. Rubbish. Right, and the question is why. Now, I've had smart people point out to me that their worst reports are in the names of these juveniles, like Vicky Hsu, the girl there, Nathan Rusa, etc. Really, really young people that put their name on the reports that say the most outlandish, crazy things that cannot be backed up, that you can tear to shreds. And the big guys at ASPI, like Peter Jennings, Michael Shoebridge, etc., their names are never on them. Right. They
use disposable people for that.
That's exactly what it is. That in case it blows up, it'll be pinned on those guys. Now I have to tell you a funny story though, because when that hearing was taking place. That was in Parliament upstairs. I was downstairs in the main committee room at that very time, and participating in another hearing on a political issue that these posters relate to our postal service here. And one of the senators from that hearing, who's behind this war push, Kimberly Kitching, went from that hearing and came down and joined the hearing I was participating in. And then she turned it into an attack on me. She rips into me, attacking me for who I am. And I'm thinking, you're not just worried about what I've done in relation to this issue. This is clearly associated with the China issue as well. The next day, I'm flying home back to Melbourne, and who's on my plane but that girl with no hair, Vicky Xu. She was on my plane. Yeah. And I'm sending messages to people. Oh, Vicky Xu's on my plane. Should I talk to her? Now, one wise person said, no. She'll interpret that as some kind of aggression, etc. Someone else, a woman, said, no, you should. Right. So I took her. Anyway, I decided I wasn't going to talk to her in the plane, because you can't escape in a plane. So that could be a bit aggressive.
Yeah, that's a good call.
But I got out of the plane, went to catch a cab. There was no one at the airport because it's in COVID conditions. Went to catch a cab. I'm the only one standing there at the taxi rank, and I'm waiting for a cab to come. And who should come and stand right beside me? Is Vicky Xu. And I'm thinking, I got to say something. And I introduced myself. I said, oh, I'm Robbie Barwick. Remember me? And she goes, I said, I'm the guy on Twitter you called the fat old bald fuck. And she goes, oh. She did remember then. And I said to her, you do understand why people like me are alarmed at where this is going, right? We don't want a war with China. And she said straight away, I'm already at war with China. And I said, no, we don't want a real war with China. And she insisted, no, I'm in a real war with China. And I realized our CADs came at that point, and I just
there's nothing there, nothing of substance there.
Nothing, but her feeling, like in her mind, this was as extreme as any expression of it I've ever seen. She was expressing this absolute animosity that she has to her home country. And that's, but in that way, she's similar to everyone else at ASPI, and it's pretty bad. But for some reason, she's left them now. I'm not sure why. Well, it'd be interesting to see where she turns up again.
I mean, her emotions are probably real. I mean, I think she's gotten a lot of backlash from ordinary Chinese people in China who see through her BS. An extreme version of that also happens in the Tibetan community. I have a overseas Tibetan who he was born into the exile community, and he's very unusual. He's very pro-China. He saw through the propaganda. He's come and seen China for himself. But he can't speak up. If he speaks up, he will be completely, rejected from his community, and it's even actually to the point where it's dangerous. If you look at how the Tibetan community persecuted Shugden Buddhists, a lot of people are surprised at how violent some of these groups can be. But in Europe, you get a lot of people from India, Tibetans who were born in India, who throw away their passports and they go to Europe. And then they make up the story. Their mother was raped by the Chinese military and all this kind of stuff. They saw it happen in front of their eyes, but they've never set foot in China. And then they get asylum and residency in Europe. My friend said that a lot of the European governments, they actually know it's fake. Like this is a Tibetan guy showing up with a thick Indian accent saying that this is what he saw. But they don't care because they have some sort of a quota or something like that, and they know that generally speaking, Tibetans don't cause problems in society. They can say, okay, they accepted this many refugees or something like that. But he says when you hang out with these guys in bars and stuff like that, even though they've never set foot in China like he has, they get emotional when they're talking about China and their hatred towards China because it came from so much indoctrination. They were inside that, just like we were talking about when you're inside something. And they said that these people will literally break down crying, and they don't know anything about China. They haven't been to China like he has. They haven't been through Tibet like he has as a Tibetan who was born in exile. Now, what's interesting, and this won't make it into Western media too much, more and more Tibetans are leaving India, and some of them are actually returning to Tibet. Some of them have actually sought to return to Tibet. China is very careful with them because obviously they're coming from a separatist community that was radicalized to a certain degree. But I'm not gonna say that Vicky Xu is completely a fake. Maybe she really is totally emotionally caught up in this, and she really believes that she's on some sort of a battle of good versus evil. I mean, that is completely possible, but she's certainly being used by ASPI.
I do think the emotion related to, though, that she had that social media storm, and it was that's why she was coming to Melbourne. She was appearing on television to talk about that. And I suspect that's what she was really, so that can bring it home and make it personal, because up until then, she was doing her anti-China stuff as a comedy act. She wanted to be a comedian.
Oh, right, yeah,
right.
Yeah.
And I don't know how genuine the actual China issue per se is, but the animosity she feels, and now it's become personal. But then she's left ASPI, and I'm not sure where that fits in the whole picture as well. But certainly,
maybe the whole. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just saying this phenomenon of ASPI using young people to prosecute their case, so that because they're dispensable.
Maybe it still is a comedy act. Maybe the whole thing is like she's filming a Borat-style movie where she joins a think tank funded by military-industrial complex to fight for human rights alongside people who bomb Muslims elsewhere. Like they just chose the most funny situation, and she's like, saw this and said, "There's nothing more comical than this. I'm going to work for a think tank that's funded by weapons manufacturers that destroy Muslim countries who are speaking up for Muslims in China. And then when it's all done, I'm going to put the movie together and release it like a Borat film or something like that."
Well, now you've got my hopes up. I mean, this is the country that when you fly into Canberra Airport, which is the capital city, but it's a small city. You fly into Canberra Airport and you're at the carousel getting your luggage. All the big billboards inside the airport are all for weapons manufacturers, Thales, Lockheed Martin, etc. Right? The town is defined by this phenomenon. That's where ASPI is. It runs the whole place. This is what Australia has become. You got one Chinese member of parliament, just one in the whole parliament, even though there's 1 million Chinese people in Australia. One's Chinese. She's actually from Hong Kong originally, right? She grew up in British Hong Kong therefore, right? She's a pro Hong Kong independence, like at a low level, Chinese person. But like every other Chinese person, even though wanting to be more Hong Kong, she, like everyone else, has done business with China, and she's accused of being a Chinese spy in the parliament just because she's Chinese, right?
Yeah, you remember that? I mean, that was the whole Erica Betts thing, also demanding that Australian-born Chinese would denounce the Chinese Communist Party.
Before they testified, he wanted them to denounce the Chinese Communist Party to show their loyalty to Australia. And it really is Borat-esque. You've given me a great mental image there. I'm going to use that. It really is Borat-esque. Monty Python couldn't write this script in terms of what Australia's become.
It's true. I wonder if that's a way to get through to people and say that if you were to write a comedy about, think tanks and the way the world works, all the ingredients are here. You wouldn't have to use any more imagination for people to take a step back and say, hold on a second, this is kind of comical here. How is this even possible? How is this even reality? I mean, yeah. So I'm gonna just go through the other question. I've been holding you for 3 hours here. You got to go soon? I've got a couple more questions. We can try to rip through them.
Let's rip through these questions, but then I do have to go.
Okay. All right. So, actually, that was the last question. That was it. That was I just got. Yeah, perfect. So no answers from reasonable answers from Rex. Let me read that one more time before we log off here, to show you what it was he responded with. Let's see here, the final reply. So yeah. As you may be aware from Rex's social media updates, the Senator and myself have been traveling around in South Australia, assisting and meeting with constituents during the parliamentary break, thus delayed a response due to limited signal. He has another week on the road to get out of the SA region. And you may be aware that the Senator's banning of imported goods made with Uyghur slave labor, which is what I was under the impression you wanted to discuss, has changed to encompass items made from slave labor. Oh,
from any reason.
nope. Sorry. That was no. Sorry, guys. I messed up there. So this was the original one, where he said that much of the material sent to the Senator Patrick via Amalia is commentary, and the questions are scarce. And then you guys can pause that yourself afterwards if you need to on the replay. But he didn't really answer any of those questions that I put forward to him. Again, the implications are too high if he actually engaged with any of those questions in an honest way. And I think that really says everything about this. So what we're going to do here, we're going to wrap this up. If you had any final words, Robbie, or a request from your audience to be a little bit more open-minded towards this stuff, and also repeating your website address and all that kind of stuff where people can check out more of your work, we'll end on that note.
Yeah, look, if you're an Australian watching this, you can get involved in what we're trying to do, because we do hit it hard, because we don't think there's any other way. You've got to. The disinformation has to be exposed. So use our website as a resource, citizensparty.org.au, and you can call in on our toll-free number 1-800-636-432. We have a sections there called Latest Updates Archive, and you can go through there, or you can go through our media releases, and you'll see the media releases we do on this issue on China-related matters, and you'll see some of they tend to link to these long-form articles we do. So that includes the China Narrative series, the Xinjiang series, some of this stuff on Rex Patrick and Andrew Hastie and terrorism. There's a related issue at the moment around this real act of foreign interference, where our government resisted passing what's called a Magnitsky Act, which would be used to sanction officials in other countries accused of human rights abuses. Now they've buckled this week and last week and said they will, and it's the anti-China crowd behind that as well, because they want to use it to sanction officials in Xinjiang and other officials in China, just to keep stirring the pot, right? That's what you can do. And this is a terrible law, because it'll be used to sanction people without evidence and without due process, right? But it makes the existence of a law like this makes sure that countries can never come together to actually resolve these differences. All human beings on the planet, in our view, should aspire to some kind of resolution, peaceful resolution, where we respect each other's differences, but say, okay, there must be a basis upon which we can cooperate, right? And we should we've been saying for a long time, the United States, Russia, China, and India, the four great powers, should get together, work out their differences, work out a basis for cooperation. The rest of the world will come along, right? This was the original idea behind the UN Security Council, by the way, and the UN. But let's actually make it work, so that we can come up with a basis for peace. Because if we don't, if we keep going down the path we're going, it is really, really alarming. And if you ever get a war, the whole debate is moot, right? It doesn't matter who's done what to whom. Then you're in a war. It's hell. Justice Robert Jackson. I'll give a plug for our YouTube channel. It's not as big as yours, Daniel, but it's called The Citizens Report. People can follow us on there.
I'll put it in the description also. Yep.
Our show goes on to public television in Australia, public access television in Australia, so it gets a bit of an audience that way. But it hasn't done too badly. But we have a weekly show, but we also do these interviews, longer interviews. And I interviewed an American historian who's a friend of mine, Anton Chaikin, and he chose to call the interview "The United States of America: A Blessing or a Curse to Mankind." And what he wanted to get across in that interview, because he's just written a book called "Who We Are." This is the name of the book, and it's actually America's Fight for Universal Progress from Franklin to Kennedy, because we tend to have in these discussions, and rightly so, we bag America a lot, but that's not the whole history of the United States. And there's other things about American history that have been quite brilliant, right? But he's identified what caused that, like where that came from, and why it's suppressed now, why it's gone, it's disappeared out of. That's not America anymore. It's become the empire that it fought against to become an independent country, right? But one of his favorite themes is after we defeated Nazis, fascism in World War II, and they had the Nuremberg trials, Justice Robert Jackson gave a speech where he said the greatest crime was war itself, because that's the framework in which all the war crimes get committed, war itself. Right, and sometimes there is such a thing as a just war. But what we've been living through, this regime change agenda, is evil. And if we let clearly evil people, warmongers, turn just out of whatever deranged mania is in their mind, turn that against China and Russia, and that becomes the biggest war in history, then we will regret it, right? So we have a window of opportunity to do something now, and that means combating the disinformation in your fellow man and woman in Australia and every other country, and trying to inspire them that there can be an alternative. And frankly, we all want a better economy, and the country that's giving us the best example of a good functioning economy is the country that we're being conditioned to hate the most, right? Imagine economic cooperation with China and what that can do for the world, rather than all that being demonized. So that's where we're coming from. That's why we're motivated to hit it hard. So yeah, if you're in Australia, join up, get involved, get in contact, and you can help a lot.
Absolutely. No, that sounds good. That's a good note to end on. I think there's a lot of valuable things that people need to take into consideration. Even speaking about American history, even Eisenhower in his farewell speech said that everybody needed to guard against the influence of the military-industrial complex and its ability to affect public policy. Yep. And here you have a think tank that's exactly funded by the military-industrial complex in Australia, shaping public policy, doing exactly what Eisenhower warned about. This stuff is a lot more serious than people realize. People need to start paying attention. So, thank you also, Robbie, for everything you do. And we'll wrap it up here, and we can look in the future to maybe talking about some other topics. Yeah.
We'll stay in touch, but I'll have to in the future when you say let's do a show, I'll have to clear my schedule.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, clear out a 5-hour window.
All right.
All right. Thanks a lot.
Daniel.
And thanks everybody for joining.
Thanks for hanging in, viewers. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. Thanks everybody, and we'll see you next time. Okay. And there we go. Oh, still ending there. Okay. Well, I think it's delayed, but we'll log off directly from here. So yeah,
All right.
It's not working. All right. See you guys. See everybody.
Yeah.